Rule 1. Listen to understand, not to respond. Communication theory identifies a fundamental disconnect between the stated purpose of conversational exchange and the cognitive processes that occur during typical dialogue. Research in conversational analysis suggests that most participants in verbal exchange allocate cognitive resources not to the comprehension and integration of incoming information, but rather to the formulation of response content. This pattern has been documented across multiple linguistic contexts and appears to persist regardless of cultural background or individual awareness of the phenomenon. The neurological basis for this response preparation involves prefrontal cortex activation during conversational pauses, indicating that verbal exchange often functions as a sequential monologue structure rather than a genuine information exchange. Studies using fMRI technology have identified distinct neural patterns that differentiate active listening from response formulation, though the boundary between these states remains imprecisely defined in current literature. What constitutes genuine comprehension versus performative engagement continues to generate debate within cognitive psychology frameworks. The distinction between understanding-oriented listening and response-oriented listening appears to involve different patterns of memory encoding and empathic accuracy. When cognitive resources are allocated to response preparation during incoming message processing, encoding depth for the speaker's content diminishes measurably. This trade-off has been observed in laboratory settings, though its magnitude in naturalistic conversation remains difficult to quantify. The relationship between listening orientation and long-term relationship quality has been proposed but not conclusively demonstrated through longitudinal research. Conversational turn-taking norms vary across cultures in ways that complicate universal prescriptions. Some linguistic communities value rapid response and overlapping speech, while others emphasize longer pauses and complete message processing before reply initiation. Whether these variations reflect different listening orientations or merely different temporal conventions remains unclear. The adaptive value of either listening approach likely depends on contextual factors that have not been systematically mapped. The psychological mechanisms that might enable understanding-oriented listening include metacognitive monitoring of comprehension, deliberate suppression of response generation impulses, and increased allocation of working memory resources to speaker content. Individual differences in these capacities may explain variability in natural listening orientation. Whether these capacities can be enhanced through training or whether they represent relatively stable cognitive traits remains an open empirical question. Social psychology research on perspective taking suggests that accurate understanding of others' mental states requires effortful cognitive processing that is often bypassed in favor of projection-based inference. Projection involves assuming that others think and feel as oneself would in similar circumstances, a strategy that is computationally efficient but frequently inaccurate. The conditions that promote perspective-taking over projection in conversational contexts have been partially identified but not comprehensively catalogued. Rule 2. Seek win-win outcomes. Conflict resolution literature proposes that optimal outcomes in disagreement scenarios may not follow zero-sum distributions. Game theory models suggest that certain interactive frameworks permit value creation rather than mere value redistribution. The mathematical proofs underlying these models rely on assumptions about rational actor behavior that may not align with observed human decision-making patterns. Laboratory studies attempting to replicate win-win outcomes show inconsistent results, with success rates varying based on factors that have not been fully isolated. The psychological mechanisms that might enable mutually beneficial outcomes involve concepts like fairness, perception, autonomy, maintenance, and intrinsic motivation structures. These constructs interact in ways that current research has not fully mapped. Some theorists propose that win-win frameworks activate different neural reward pathways compared to competitive scenarios, though the evidence supporting this distinction remains preliminary. The long-term sustainability of cooperative strategies in repeated interaction contexts depends on variables that may be culturally specific or context-dependent in ways that complicate generalization. Negotiation research distinguishes between distributive and integrative bargaining frameworks. Distributive approaches assume fixed resource pools and focus on claiming maximum individual shares, while integrative approaches seek to expand available resources through creative problem solving. The conditions that favor integrative negotiation include multiple issue dimensions, differing preference orderings across parties, and sufficient trust to enable information sharing. However, the frequency with which these conditions occur in naturalistic settings has not been established. The psychological barriers to win-win thinking include competitive schema activation, fixed pie perception bias, and reactive devaluation of opponent-proposed solutions. These cognitive patterns appear to operate automatically in many conflict contexts, though their strength varies with individual differences in social value orientation and prior negotiation training. Whether these biases can be durably modified through intervention or whether they represent stable cognitive tendencies remains an open question in the literature. Cultural variation in conflict resolution preferences complicates attempts to identify universally optimal strategies. Some cultures prioritize relationship preservation and indirect communication, while others value directness and explicit problem solving. These preferences appear to reflect deeper cultural values regarding individualism, collectivism, power distance, and uncertainty avoidance. The extent to which individuals can adaptively shift strategies across cultural contexts versus remain constrained by socialized preferences represents an unresolved issue in cross-cultural psychology. The relationship between short-term and long-term outcomes in negotiation presents additional complexity. Strategies that maximize immediate gains may damage relationship quality and reduce future cooperation probability. However, excessive prioritization of relationship maintenance may lead to inadequate advocacy for one's interests and eventual resentment accumulation. The optimal balance likely varies with relationship type, time horizon, and individual personality characteristics in ways that resist simple prescription. Rule 3. Complement effort, not just outcome. Attribution theory distinguishes between praise directed at outcomes versus praise directed at process variables. Carol Dweck's research on mindset differentiation suggests that feedback emphasizing effort rather than innate ability may influence subsequent behavioral patterns, particularly in learning contexts. The underlying mechanism appears to involve how individuals construct internal narratives about their capabilities and the stability of those capabilities over time. Whether these effects persist outside controlled academic environments or across diverse demographic populations remains an active area of investigation. The neurobiological correlates of effort-based versus outcome-based praise involve different patterns of dopaminergic activation, though the functional significance of these differences is not yet established. Some studies indicate that effort praise may reduce fear of failure by decoupling performance from fixed identity constructs. while other research suggests that the effects may be more dependent on pre-existing self-efficacy levels than on the praise structure itself. The interaction between praise type and individual psychological profiles introduces complexity that current models have not fully addressed. Mindset theory proposes two distinct orientational frameworks: fixed mindset, characterized by belief in stable traits, and growth mindset, characterized by belief in malleable capabilities. The theory suggests that praise type influences which framework becomes dominant, with outcome praise reinforcing fixed mindset and effort praise reinforcing growth mindset. However, the causal evidence for these relationships comes primarily from correlational studies and short-term interventions, with limited long-term follow-up data. The specificity of praise messages appears to moderate their effectiveness. Generic effort praise, such as "you worked hard," may be less impactful than specific effort recognition that identifies particular strategies or behaviors. The optimal level of specificity likely varies with developmental stage, domain expertise, and individual preference in ways that simple prescriptions cannot capture. The role of praise authenticity versus praise content in determining effectiveness remains inadequately studied. Developmental psychology research suggests that the impact of praise type may vary across age ranges. Young children may respond differently than adolescents or adults to effort versus outcome praise, possibly due to differences in self-concept stability or social comparison processes. The age-related trajectory of praise effectiveness has not been comprehensively mapped, limiting ability to provide developmentally tailored guidance. Cross-cultural research on praise practices reveals substantial variation in what is considered appropriate or effective feedback. Some cultures emphasize criticism and improvement-focused feedback, while others prioritize encouragement and positive reinforcement. These cultural differences may reflect different implicit theories about motivation, learning, and the social functions of feedback. Whether effort-based praise operates similarly across cultural contexts or whether its effects are culturally bounded remains unclear. Rule 4. Own your slice of the mess first. Conflict resolution frameworks incorporate concepts from behavioral psychology regarding responsibility attribution and reciprocity mechanisms. The strategic disclosure of personal accountability in disagreement scenarios appears to influence the probability of reciprocal disclosure from other parties, though the causal pathways underlying this effect are debated. Some researchers attribute this pattern to threat reduction in social environments, while others emphasize the role of social proof or modeling effects. The temporal sequencing of accountability statements may interact with emotional arousal states in ways that affect receptivity to the information. Current research has not established optimal timing parameters or clarified how individual differences in emotional regulation capacity moderate these effects. The generalizability of laboratory findings to naturalistic conflict scenarios remains uncertain, as ecological validity in this domain is difficult to establish through controlled experimentation. The concept of internal locus of control refers to the tendency to attribute outcomes to one's own actions rather than external circumstances. Research suggests that internal attribution patterns correlate with various adaptive outcomes, though causality is difficult to establish. Whether encouraging internal attribution for negative outcomes produces beneficial effects or merely shifts responsibility without enabling genuine behavior change represents an unresolved question. Reciprocity theory proposes that cooperative gestures tend to elicit cooperative responses through multiple possible mechanisms including fairness, norm activation, relationship debt perception, and reputation management. The strength and reliability of reciprocity effects vary considerably across contexts and populations. Some research suggests that initial cooperation is more effective in individualist cultures, while others find stronger effects in collectivist contexts. The conditions that enhance or suppress reciprocity dynamics have not been comprehensively identified. The distinction between genuine accountability and strategic impression management presents challenges for both research and practice. Accountability statements may be motivated by authentic recognition of fault, desire to de-escalate conflict, or concern about social perception. These different motivations may produce similar behavioral outputs but different downstream consequences for relationship quality and personal integrity. Methods for distinguishing authentic from strategic accountability remain underdeveloped. Power dynamics appear to influence the effectiveness and interpretation of accountability statements. Acknowledgements of fault from high-power individuals may be perceived differently than identical statements from low-power individuals. The asymmetry in these perceptions and its implications for conflict resolution in hierarchical relationships have been noted but not systematically studied. Whether accountability strategies should be adjusted based on power position remains an open question. Rule 5. Mirror feelings first. Fixes can wait. Emotional validation theory proposes that acknowledgement of affective states precedes effective problem-solving in support interactions. The psychological basis for this sequencing involves emotional arousal reduction through limbic system regulation, though the specific neural mechanisms remain incompletely characterized. Research indicates that premature solution offering may activate defensive responses, but the threshold at which support transitions from validating to problem-solving varies across individuals and contexts in ways that have not been systematically mapped. The concept of mirroring in communication refers to the reflection of expressed emotional content without immediate redirection toward solutions. This practice appears to facilitate parasympathetic activation and reduce cortisol levels in some experimental contexts, though effect sizes are modest and replication efforts have shown mixed results. Whether mirroring functions primarily through felt understanding, reduced cognitive load, or alternative mechanisms remains unclear in the current literature. The timing of transition from emotional validation to problem-solving represents a significant challenge in support provision. Transitioning too quickly may invalidate the emotional experience, while excessive validation without progression may reinforce rumination or helplessness. The optimal duration of validation phases likely varies with emotion, intensity, problem type, and individual coping style in ways that resist simple prescription. Different emotional expression styles may require different validation approaches. Some individuals explicitly request advice and may experience pure validation as unhelpful avoidance, while others seek primarily emotional processing space. The ability to accurately assess which response is needed represents a dimension of emotional intelligence that has been theoretically proposed but inadequately operationalized in research contexts. Gender differences in preference for emotional validation versus problem-solving support have been proposed in popular psychology literature, though empirical evidence for these differences is mixed and effect sizes are generally small when found. Stereotypical assumptions about gender-based support preferences may produce self-fulfilling prophecies or limit exploration of individual variation. The relative contribution of biological versus socialized factors to any observed differences remains contentious. The concept of co-regulation refers to the mutual influence of emotional states between interaction partners. Effective emotional support may function partly through physiological synchronization processes that occur during attentive listening and empathic responding. The mechanisms underlying co-regulation and the conditions that enhance or impair it have been partially identified through research on parent-infant dyads, but remain understudied in adult relationships. Rule 6. Keep your humor fresh. Humor psychology identifies habituation as a central factor in response attenuation to repeated stimuli. The novelty-based model of humor suggests that unexpectedness triggers reward pathway activation, while predictability diminishes this response through neural adaptation. However, some forms of humor appear to resist habituation effects, suggesting that additional variables beyond pure novelty may contribute to sustained humor responses. The parameters that distinguish habituating from non-habituating humor remain poorly understood. Social bonding through humor appears to depend partly on shared attentional focus and temporal synchrony, concepts that overlap with research on group cohesion and collective behavior. Whether humor requires ongoing novelty to maintain bonding functions, or whether certain forms of humor derive value from repetition and familiarity represents an unresolved question in social psychology. Cultural variations in humor, structure, and function further complicate attempts to develop universal theories. The relationship between humor, repetition, and social perception involves complex dynamics. Repeated jokes may signal low creativity or social awareness, potentially damaging social standing. However, in-group humor markers often involve repeated references that strengthen group identity through shared knowledge activation. The boundary between bonding repetition and alienating repetition depends on factors including group membership, status relationships, and context formality. Improvisational humor versus scripted humor may engage different cognitive processes and serve different social functions. Improvisational responses to immediate context demonstrate attentional presence and social attunement, while prepared humor demonstrates deliberation and effort investment. The relative social value of these humor types likely varies across cultures and situations in ways that have not been systematically studied. The concept of humor as social lubricant suggests that well-timed humor reduces tension and facilitates difficult conversations. However, humor can also be weaponized to demean, exclude, or deflect from serious issues. The factors that determine whether humor serves constructive versus destructive functions in specific interactions include power dynamics, relationship quality, and topic sensitivity. Predictive models for humor appropriateness remain crude and context-specific. Individual differences in humor, appreciation, and production relate to personality dimensions, including extroversion, openness to experience, and cognitive flexibility. These relationships suggest that humor preferences and capacities may be relatively stable individual characteristics rather than purely situational phenomena. Whether humor skills can be developed through practice or training, or whether they depend primarily on trait-level characteristics, has received limited empirical attention. Rule 7. Prioritize presence over ping. Attention research identifies a phenomenon termed attention residue, where cognitive resources remain partially allocated to previous stimuli even after conscious focus has shifted. This effect appears particularly pronounced in contexts involving frequent task switching or interruption, though the duration and magnitude of residual effects vary based on factors including task complexity, emotional valence, and individual working memory capacity. Whether attention residue represents a fixed cognitive constraint or a modifiable pattern remains debated. The relationship between attention quality and social bonding involves multiple proposed mechanisms, including memory encoding specificity, emotional attunement accuracy, and perceived investment signaling. Research using eye tracking and behavioral coding suggests that attention allocation patterns influence relationship satisfaction, though causality in these associations has not been definitively established. The relative contribution of attention presence versus attention quality to relational outcomes requires further investigation. Digital device presence appears to influence conversation quality even when devices are not actively used. The mere visibility of mobile phones has been associated with reduced conversation intimacy and lower reported relationship quality in some experimental studies, though effect sizes are small and moderating variables have not been fully identified. Whether these effects reflect actual attention impacts or merely symbolic interpretation of device presence remains unclear. Multitasking research consistently demonstrates performance decrements across simultaneously executed tasks, though individuals tend to overestimate their multitasking capacity. The cognitive mechanisms underlying multitasking costs include task switching overhead, working memory interference, and goal neglect. Whether these costs apply equally to social interaction as to other cognitive tasks has not been thoroughly examined. The concept of continuous partial attention describes a state of constantly monitoring multiple information streams without fully engaging with any single stream. This attentional pattern may represent an adaptation to information-rich environments, though its consequences for cognitive performance and well-being are debated. Some researchers propose that continuous partial attention impairs deep thinking and relationship quality, while others suggest it may enable efficient information processing in certain contexts. Neuroplasticity research raises questions about whether chronic digital device use produces lasting changes in attention capacity and control. Some studies report associations between high device use and reduced sustained attention ability, though establishing causation is difficult given self-selection factors. Whether any observed effects represent permanent changes versus reversible adaptations remains unclear. The long-term consequences of technology-mediated communication patterns on social and cognitive development represent an area of active concern but limited definitive evidence. Rule 8. Pass the praise, hold the fault. Attribution patterns in social perception show systematic biases in how responsibility is assigned for positive and negative outcomes. The fundamental attribution error describes the tendency to attribute others' behaviors to dispositional factors while attributing one's own behaviors to situational factors. This asymmetry appears robust across diverse populations, though its magnitude varies with cultural context and individual differences in cognitive style. Leadership psychology suggests that credit distribution and fault assumption patterns influence group dynamics through trust development, psychological safety creation, and norm establishment. However, the optimal balance between self-promotion and credit sharing may depend on organizational context, power dynamics, and cultural expectations in ways that complicate prescription. Some research suggests that excessive self-deprecation may undermine perceived competence, while other studies emphasize authenticity as a primary driver of follower trust. The concept of internal locus of control refers to the attribution of outcomes to personal agency rather than external factors. Leaders who demonstrate internal attribution for negative outcomes while externalizing attribution for positive outcomes may build credibility through perceived fairness and humility. However, this pattern could also signal low self-efficacy or generate confusion about actual causality. The boundary between adaptive and maladaptive attribution patterns in leadership contexts remains poorly defined. Social reinforcement theory proposes that public recognition strengthens behavior repetition through multiple mechanisms, including status enhancement, social proof, and intrinsic satisfaction. The effectiveness of public praise may depend on organizational culture, with some contexts favoring individual recognition and others preferring collective acknowledgement. Cross-cultural research on optimal recognition practices remains limited. The self-serving bias describes the tendency to attribute positive outcomes to internal factors and negative outcomes to external factors. This bias appears to serve self-esteem maintenance functions but may impair accurate performance assessment and learning from mistakes. Whether deliberately countering the self-serving bias through reversed attribution patterns produces beneficial outcomes or creates alternative distortions has not been adequately tested. Impression management theory examines how individuals strategically present themselves to influence others' perceptions. Credit sharing and fault assumption may be motivated by genuine beliefs about causality or by strategic concern about social image. Observers may attempt to distinguish genuine from strategic behavior through consistency assessment, but the reliability of such judgments remains questionable. The tension between authentic and strategic self-presentation complicates both research and practical guidance in this domain. Rule 9. Kindness is doing, not offering. The psychology of helping behavior distinguishes between offers of assistance and concrete actions. Social friction theory proposes that vague offers impose cognitive and emotional costs on potential recipients by requiring need articulation, request formulation, and vulnerability exposure. These costs may exceed the perceived value of uncertain help, resulting in offer rejection or avoidance. Specific, actionable assistance proposals theoretically reduce these barriers by minimizing decision-making requirements and ambiguity. However, the psychological impact of unsolicited specific help versus solicited general support has not been systematically compared. Some individuals may experience autonomy threats or obligation concerns when receiving unrequested specific assistance, suggesting that help effectiveness may depend on relationship context and recipient preferences in complex ways. The interaction between helper motivation, perception, and help acceptance likelihood represents an underexplored area in prosocial behavior research. Decision fatigue research demonstrates that choice-making depletes regulatory resources, with depletion magnitude varying based on choice complexity, quantity, and personal importance. Individuals experiencing cognitive or emotional depletion show reduced capacity for additional decisions. Whether help-seeking specifically suffers under depletion conditions or whether all social behaviors are equally affected remains unclear. The concept of proactive empathy refers to anticipating others' needs without explicit request. This capacity appears to vary considerably across individuals and may correlate with perspective-taking ability, relationship knowledge, and attentional resources. Whether proactive empathy can be trained or whether it represents stable individual differences has not been established. Cultural norms regarding helping behavior vary substantially. Some cultures emphasize indirect assistance that preserves recipient autonomy and face, while others value direct intervention. These preferences appear linked to broader cultural dimensions, including individualism, collectivism, and communication context dependency. The appropriateness of specific versus general help offers likely varies across cultural contexts in ways that complicate universal recommendations. The relationship between help provision and relationship dynamics is bidirectional. Effective help may strengthen relationships through gratitude and interdependence, but help may also create power imbalances, dependency, or indebtedness feelings. The factors that determine whether help enhances or strains relationships include reciprocity, expectations, help quality, and recipient self-esteem. Models attempting to predict help consequences from initial conditions remain underdeveloped. Rule 10. Rest is a strategy, not a reward. Fatigue science distinguishes between rest as reward and rest as strategic performance input. Cognitive load theory suggests that sustained mental effort depletes regulatory resources in ways that impair subsequent executive function, decision quality, and creative capacity. The depletion model proposes that rest intervals enable resource restoration, though the underlying mechanisms are debated and may involve glucose metabolism, neurotransmitter replenishment, or alternative physiological processes. The optimal timing, duration, and structure of rest periods vary based on task demands and individual differences in ways that current research has not fully specified. Some evidence suggests that preemptive rest intervals may provide greater performance benefits than recovery periods initiated after exhaustion onset, though this relationship may be nonlinear and context-dependent. The role of rest quality versus rest quantity in performance outcomes remains inadequately characterized. The concept of strategic rest distinguishes passive recovery from active restoration practices. Passive rest involves simple disengagement from demanding tasks, while active restoration may include practices such as nature exposure, social interaction, or engaging hobbies. Whether active restoration provides superior recovery compared to passive rest depends on the type of depletion experienced and individual restoration preferences. Cultural attitudes toward rest vary considerably, with some societies valuing continuous productivity and others incorporating rest into daily rhythms through practices such as siesta traditions or tea ceremonies. Whether these cultural differences reflect different underlying biological needs or merely different interpretive frameworks remains an open question. The relationship between cultural rest norms and population-level health outcomes has not been comprehensively examined. Sleep research provides strong evidence that adequate sleep is essential for cognitive performance, emotional regulation, and physical health. However, the relationship between wakeful rest periods and these same outcomes is less well established. Whether brief rest intervals during waking hours provide benefits analogous to sleep or whether they function through entirely different mechanisms requires clarification. The emerging field of recovery research examines how individuals replenish resources depleted through work demands. Recovery appears to depend on psychological detachment from work, relaxation, mastery experiences, and control over leisure time. The relative importance of these factors and their interaction effects have been partially mapped but remain incompletely understood. Individual differences in recovery needs and optimal recovery activities represent an area requiring further investigation. Rule 11. Spot potential and name it aloud. Recognition of potential in others involves a form of social feedback that may influence self-efficacy development and internal narrative construction. Self-efficacy theory proposes that beliefs about personal capabilities affect goal selection, effort, investment, and persistence in the face of obstacles. External recognition may strengthen these beliefs through multiple pathways, including information provision, social proof, or emotional validation, though the relative contribution of each pathway likely varies across individuals and developmental stages. The timing of recognition relative to skill development may moderate its effectiveness. Early-stage recognition might encourage exploration but could also create performance pressure, while late-stage recognition might validate existing self-beliefs but provide less developmental impetus. The specificity and credibility of recognition messages interact with recipient characteristics to determine impact in ways that simple models do not capture. Positive reinforcement theory suggests that behavior acknowledgement increases repetition probability. However, the application of this principle to complex human behaviors such as skill development involves complications including delayed reinforcement effects, multiple competing reinforcers, and individual differences in reinforcement sensitivity. Whether external recognition consistently influences internal motivation or whether it sometimes undermines intrinsic interest represents an ongoing debate in motivational psychology. The concept of stereotype threat describes performance impairment that occurs when individuals fear confirming negative group stereotypes. Positive recognition that counters stereotype expectations might reduce threat effects and improve performance. However, the relationship between recognition, timing, authenticity, and stereotype threat reduction has not been systematically investigated. Developmental research suggests that the impact of potential recognition varies across lifespan stages. Children and adolescents may be particularly responsive to external feedback due to less consolidated self-concepts, while adults may show more stability in self-beliefs and correspondingly reduced sensitivity to recognition. The developmental trajectory of recognition effectiveness and its interaction with identity development processes remain inadequately mapped. The distinction between potential recognition and performance recognition involves different temporal orientations and risk profiles. Recognizing potential involves predicting future capability based on limited current evidence, which introduces uncertainty and possible error. Performance recognition involves acknowledging demonstrated accomplishment, which carries less prediction risk but may come too late to influence development. The optimal balance between these recognition types likely varies with individual characteristics and situational demands. Rule 12. Offer the last slice and mean it. Social exchange theory examines reciprocity norms and fairness perceptions in resource distribution scenarios. The last piece phenomenon in shared consumption contexts activates complex social calculations regarding perceived entitlement, generosity, signaling, and group harmony maintenance. Behavioral studies suggest that genuine versus performative offers may be distinguished through micro-expression analysis, hesitation patterns, and contextual cues, though conscious deception detection rates remain near chance levels in most populations. The psychological function of small generosity acts appears to involve trust accumulation, norm reinforcement, and social identity signaling. However, the mechanisms through which these effects operate and their relative importance across different relationship types and cultural contexts remain incompletely understood. Whether generosity is primarily processed as costly signaling or as direct evidence of pro-social motivation represents an ongoing theoretical debate. Costly signaling theory proposes that actions involving personal sacrifice credibly communicate qualities such as pro-social orientation or resource abundance because they cannot be easily faked, The last slice scenario represents a low-cost signal that may still convey meaningful information about dispositional characteristics. However, the interpretation of such signals depends on observer beliefs about the signaler's costs and alternative motivations. Fairness norms vary across cultures, with some emphasizing strict equality, others prioritizing equity based on contribution, and still others focusing on need-based distribution. These different fairness frameworks lead to different interpretations of last slice offering behaviors. What constitutes appropriate generosity in one cultural context may appear excessive or inappropriate in another. The relationship between generosity and social status presents paradoxical patterns. High-status individuals may gain status through generosity displays that demonstrate resource abundance, while low-status individuals attempting similar displays may be perceived as strategic or inappropriate. These status-dependent interpretations complicate attempts to provide universal guidance about generosity expression. Experimental economics research using ultimatum games and dictator games has revealed that resource allocation decisions involve complex calculations balancing self-interest, fairness concerns, and strategic considerations. Individual differences in social value orientation predict allocation patterns, with some individuals consistently prioritizing equality while others maximize personal gain. Whether these orientations represent stable personality traits or situational responses remains debated. Rule 13. Laugh at yourself before anyone else can. Self-deprecating humor involves the strategic acknowledgement of personal flaws or mistakes in social contexts. This practice appears to influence social perception through multiple potential channels, including modesty signaling, threat reduction, and approachability enhancement. The effectiveness of self-deprecation may depend on status, context, and dosage in complex ways. Excessive self-deprecation might undermine perceived competence or create discomfort, while insufficient self-deprecation might be perceived as arrogance or rigidity. The distinction between self-deprecation as confidence signal versus insecurity signal remains poorly defined. Some research suggests that self-deprecation from high-status individuals is interpreted as confidence, while identical behavior from low-status individuals is interpreted as weakness, though this status interaction has not been consistently replicated. The role of authenticity perception in moderating self-deprecation effects requires further investigation. Embarrassment research examines the social functions of emotional displays following norm violations or public mistakes. Visible embarrassment may serve appeasement functions by communicating awareness of social standards and concern about others' evaluations. Self-deprecating humor following mistakes might serve similar functions while also demonstrating emotional control and perspective-taking capacity. The relationship between self-deprecation and psychological safety in groups has been theoretically proposed but inadequately tested. Leaders who model self-deprecation might reduce team members' concerns about judgment, potentially encouraging risk-taking and innovation. However, excessive leader self-deprecation might alternatively reduce confidence in leadership competence, creating rather than resolving anxiety. Cultural variation in self-deprecation norms complicates universal prescription. Individualist cultures that value self-promotion may interpret self-deprecation differently than collectivist cultures that emphasize modesty and harmony. The appropriateness and effectiveness of self-deprecating humor likely vary across cultural contexts in ways that have not been systematically documented. The concept of benign violation theory proposes that humor arises when situations simultaneously violate norms and appear benign. Self-deprecating humor may satisfy this formula by acknowledging violations while signaling that consequences are manageable. However, the boundary between benign and threatening violations varies individually, making humor production inherently risky and context-dependent. Rule 14. Timing matters more than truth. Temporal context influences message receptivity through emotional state modulation. Emotional regulation theory proposes that individuals have varying capacity to process complex or challenging information depending on current arousal levels and regulatory resource availability. Delivering feedback during emotional flooding states may activate defensive responses that prevent information integration, though the threshold for this effect varies considerably across individuals. The optimal delay between emotional events and feedback provision has not been established. Too brief delays may encounter regulatory barriers, while excessive delays may reduce relevance or allow problematic patterns to consolidate. The interaction between message content, delivery style, and recipient state introduces complexity that timing alone cannot resolve. Cultural norms regarding appropriate feedback timing vary widely and may moderate the applicability of general principles. The concept of emotional flooding refers to states of high physiological arousal that impair cognitive processing capacity. During flooding, prefrontal cortex function is compromised and limbic system activation dominates, reducing capacity for rational analysis and perspective taking. The duration of flooding states and the time required for return to baseline vary with individual differences in emotional regulation capacity. Conflict resolution research distinguishes between hot cognition during active emotional arousal and cold cognition during calm states. Problem-solving effectiveness appears higher during cold cognition periods, though hot cognition may provide important information about emotional priorities and relationship threats. The optimal timing for shifting from emotional processing to problem-solving has not been empirically determined. Message framing research demonstrates that identical information produces different responses depending on whether it emphasizes gains versus losses or uses positive versus negative language. Temporal framing may function analogously, with timing influencing whether messages are processed as supportive versus threatening. The mechanisms underlying temporal framing effects and their interaction with content remain inadequately specified. The concept of teachable moments suggests that certain situations create heightened receptivity to learning or behavior change. These moments may occur following mistakes, successes, or identity-relevant experiences. However, the characteristics that define teachable moments and the optimal ways to utilize them have not been systematically identified. The relationship between emotional arousal and learning readiness may be curvilinear, with both very low and very high arousal impairing receptivity. Rule 15. Give presence, not just presents. Attention is conceptualized in psychological research as a finite cognitive resource that can be divided but not duplicated. The quality of attention allocated to social interactions affects memory encoding, empathy, accuracy, and perceived relationship investment. Visible signs of divided attention, such as device checking or environmental scanning, appear to reduce reported conversation satisfaction, though the causal direction of this relationship has not been definitively established. The concept of presence extends beyond mere physical proximity to include attentional focus, emotional engagement, and responsiveness. However, the relative importance of these components and their interaction effects remain unclear. Some research suggests that attentional quality matters more than quantity, while other studies emphasize consistency over intensity. Individual differences in attention needs and perception sensitivity further complicate attempts to identify universal principles. Material gift-giving serves multiple psychological functions, including relationship maintenance, status signaling, and obligation creation. The relative importance of material versus experiential gifts varies across cultures and relationship types. Some research suggests that experiential gifts produce greater lasting satisfaction than material gifts, though this finding may be moderated by recipient preferences and gift appropriateness. The concept of emotional attunement refers to accurate perception and appropriate response to others' emotional states. Attunement appears to involve both cognitive perspective taking and affective empathy, though these components are partially dissociable. Whether attunement is best conceptualized as a trait, a state, or a skill that can be developed through practice remains debated. Research on social connection identifies multiple pathways through which relationships influence well-being, including emotional support, practical assistance, and identity affirmation. The relative contribution of these pathways varies across individuals and life stages. Presence may facilitate multiple connection pathways simultaneously, while material gift-giving primarily addresses practical assistance and symbolic relationship marking. The commercialization of gift-giving in modern consumer societies may have altered the psychological meaning and impact of material gifts. When gifts become expected rituals rather than spontaneous expressions of care, their emotional significance may diminish. Whether this cultural shift affects the relative value of presence versus presence remains an open empirical question. Rule 16. Compliments land best when spontaneous. Spontaneity in social feedback appears to influence authenticity perception. Planned or strategic compliments may activate skepticism regarding underlying motives, while spontaneous recognition is more readily integrated as genuine information. The neurological basis for this distinction may involve different processing routes for social information, with spontaneous feedback bypassing evaluative filters that analyze delayed feedback for ulterior purpose. However, the boundary between spontaneous and strategic feedback is subjective and may be influenced by factors including relationship history, individual differences in trust, tendency, and cultural norms regarding emotional expression. The optimal balance between spontaneity and thoughtfulness in feedback provision has not been empirically determined and may vary across contexts. Authenticity perception involves judgments about whether behavior aligns with underlying attitudes and emotions. Perceived authenticity influences trust, liking, and influence susceptibility. The cues that signal authenticity versus inauthenticity remain incompletely catalogued and likely vary across cultural contexts. Temporal immediacy may serve as one such cue, though its reliability and weight relative to other cues is unknown. The timing of compliments relative to the observed behavior may affect their perceived instrumentality. Immediate feedback directly following behavior might be perceived as more observationally grounded, while delayed feedback might seem more reflective but also potentially strategic. The optimal delay likely varies with relationship type and cultural context. The concept of spontaneous trait inference describes the automatic activation of trait concepts when observing others' behaviors. This cognitive process occurs rapidly and often outside awareness. Spontaneous compliments may leverage these automatic inference processes, while planned compliments may trigger more deliberative evaluation that includes motive analysis. Individual differences in compliment receptivity relate to self-esteem levels, attachment style, and prior feedback experiences. Low self-esteem individuals may discount positive feedback regardless of timing, while secure attachment individuals may readily accept compliments. These individual differences complicate attempts to identify universally optimal compliment delivery strategies. Rule 17. Check in twice. The second ask matters. Emotional masking refers to the strategic concealment of internal affective states through behavioral control. Social psychology research indicates that initial responses to emotional inquiries often represent filtered or modified versions of actual internal states, shaped by display rules, social desirability concerns, and vulnerability management. The decision to disclose authentic emotional information involves risk calculation that depends on trust levels, prior experience, and situational factors. Repeated inquiry may signal genuine interest and reduce disclosure risk perception, though excessive probing might be experienced as intrusive or violating boundaries. The threshold between appropriate follow-up and uncomfortable pressure varies individually and culturally in ways that complicate prescription. The effectiveness of second inquiries likely depends on timing, phrasing, and relational context in complex interactions that current models do not fully capture. Psychological safety refers to the belief that one can express authentic thoughts and feelings without fear of negative consequences. Safety perception influences disclosure, likelihood, and emotional authenticity in social interactions. The factors that build psychological safety include consistency, responsiveness, and non-judgment, though the relative importance of these factors remains unclear. Display rules are culturally specific norms governing appropriate emotional expression in different contexts. Cultures vary in the extent to which emotional expression is encouraged or suppressed, and in which emotions are considered appropriate for public display. These variations complicate attempts to develop universal principles for emotional inquiry and disclosure facilitation. The concept of graduated disclosure describes the progressive revelation of increasingly personal information as relationships develop and trust accumulates. Initial inquiries typically elicit surface-level responses, with deeper sharing emerging only after trust establishment. Second inquiries may signal willingness to engage beyond superficial exchange, thereby facilitating movement toward deeper disclosure. Research on loneliness and social isolation suggests that many individuals experience significant emotional distress that remains hidden from their social networks. The inability or unwillingness to disclose distress perpetuates isolation and prevents support mobilization. Whether structured approaches to emotional inquiry can effectively detect and address hidden distress without creating discomfort remains an important but underexplored question. Rule 18. Assume error, not malice. The fundamental attribution error describes the tendency to attribute others' negative behaviors to character flaws while attributing one's own negative behaviors to situational factors. This perceptual asymmetry appears robust but varies in magnitude across cultures that differ in individualism-collectivism orientation. The error may serve psychological functions including self-esteem maintenance, control perception enhancement, and simplified social cognition. Cognitive interventions that promote situational attribution for others' behaviors appear to reduce interpersonal conflict in some contexts, though the sustainability of these effects and their generalization beyond training contexts remain uncertain. Whether attribution patterns reflect fixed cognitive biases or flexible interpretive strategies that respond to contextual demands represents an ongoing debate in social cognition research. Correspondence bias refers to the tendency to infer that behavior corresponds to underlying dispositions, even when situational constraints are salient. This bias appears early in cognitive processing and requires effortful correction. The conditions that facilitate versus inhibit bias correction have been partially identified but not comprehensively mapped. The relationship between attribution style and relationship quality has been documented primarily in correlational research. Whether attribution retraining produces durable relationship improvements, or whether attribution patterns merely reflect rather than cause relationship dynamics remains unclear. The mechanisms through which attributions might influence relationship trajectories require further investigation. Evolutionary psychology perspectives propose that the fundamental attribution error may have served adaptive functions in ancestral environments by facilitating rapid threat assessment and social decision-making. Dispositional attributions enable quick predictions about future behavior based on limited information. Whether this cognitive shortcut remains adaptive in modern social environments or represents a maladaptive vestige is debated. The concept of attributional charity refers to the practice of making generous interpretations of others' negative behaviors by emphasizing situational explanations. Philosophically, attributional charity has been proposed as an ethical stance that promotes social harmony and reduces unnecessary conflict. However, excessive charity may impair accurate social perception and enable continued problematic behavior by failing to hold individuals accountable for genuine dispositional issues. Rule 19. Let one car in civilization survives another day. Prosocial behavior research examines low-cost actions that benefit others. Small cooperative gestures in shared spaces appear to influence collective functioning through norm modeling, reciprocity activation, and social trust accumulation. The mechanism underlying these effects may involve observational learning, emotional contagion, or rational updating of expectations regarding others' behavior. The sustainability of prosocial norms in the absence of individual enforcement remains a subject of theoretical debate. Some models propose that cooperative behavior is inherently unstable without sanctioning mechanisms, while others suggest that reputational effects and group selection processes can maintain cooperation. The conditions that enhance or suppress prosocial behavior cascades have not been comprehensively identified. Traffic psychology examines driver behavior in situations involving coordination problems and resource competition. Zipper merging, where vehicles alternate entry into a single lane, maximizes flow efficiency compared to early merging patterns. However, adoption of zipper merging varies widely and appears influenced by cultural norms, signage, and individual driving philosophy. The psychological experience of yielding to others in traffic situations may involve multiple competing motivations, including fairness concerns, time pressure, aggressive impulse, and reciprocity expectations. Individual differences in these motivations likely contribute to the variability in cooperative driving behavior. Whether interventions targeting specific motivations can reliably increase cooperation remains untested. The tragedy of the commons describes situations where individual rationality leads to collective harm when shared resources are overused. Traffic congestion represents a common problem where each driver's attempt to maximize personal speed contributes to systemic slowdown. Cooperative norms that involve short-term individual costs may produce long-term collective benefits, though the psychological barriers to adopting such norms are substantial. Research on moral elevation suggests that witnessing pro-social acts can inspire similar behavior in observers through emotional and motivational pathways. A single cooperative gesture in traffic may trigger chains of reciprocal cooperation. However, the magnitude and duration of these effects have not been quantified, and individual differences in susceptibility to moral elevation likely moderate outcomes substantially. Rule 20. Voice notes beat texts for complex tone. Paralinguistic communication refers to meaning conveyed through vocal characteristics including pitch, pace, volume, and rhythm rather than through semantic content. These features carry significant emotional information and disambiguate potentially ambiguous verbal messages. Text-based communication necessarily eliminates paralinguistic channels, requiring readers to infer emotional tone from limited cues. The psychological processes involved in tone inference from text include application of contextual knowledge, relationship schemas, and individual differences in interpretation bias. Ambiguous messages may be interpreted positively by secure individuals and negatively by anxious individuals, leading to divergent understandings of identical text content. The magnitude of these interpretation differences and their relationship to communication outcomes remain inadequately quantified. Voice message systems restore some paralinguistic information while retaining asynchronous communication benefits. The relative advantages of voice versus text likely depend on message complexity, emotional content, relationship closeness, and individual communication preferences. Systematic comparisons of communication effectiveness across modalities remain limited, particularly for naturalistic interactions involving emotionally significant content. The concept of media richness theory proposes that communication media vary in their capacity to convey complex information, with face-to-face interaction highest in richness and text-based communication lower. Voice messages fall intermediate on this spectrum, preserving some vocal cues while lacking visual information. Whether media richness directly predicts communication success or whether optimal media choice depends on task and relationship characteristics represents an ongoing theoretical question. Individual differences in verbal expressiveness may influence preference for voice versus text communication. Verbally expressive individuals may find voice messages more natural and efficient, while those who prefer written composition may experience voice recording as awkward or effortful. These preference differences suggest that optimal communication modality recommendations may need to be individually tailored. Cultural norms regarding communication, directness, and emotional expression influence interpretation of vocal cues. Some cultures value vocal restraint and subtle expression, while others embrace vocal animation and explicit emotion communication. These cultural differences may moderate the effectiveness of voice messages as tools for conveying complex emotional information across cultural boundaries. Rule 21. Decline like you'd want to be declined. Refusal communication represents a domain where interpersonal goal conflict emerges explicitly. The person making a request seeks assistance or inclusion, while the person declining prioritizes alternative commitments or resource conservation. Social psychology research on compliance and resistance examines the strategies individuals employ to refuse requests while managing relationship implications and self-presentation concerns. The psychological costs of declining requests include guilt about disappointing others, concern about damaged relationships, and threats to self-concept as a helpful person. These costs may lead to reluctant agreement or avoidance of situations where requests are anticipated. The magnitude of these costs appears to vary with individual differences in agreeableness, self-esteem, and people-pleasing tendencies, though the specific relationships have not been comprehensively mapped. Politeness theory proposes that communication involves face management, with face referring to the public self-image individuals seek to maintain. Requests threaten the recipient's negative face by constraining freedom of action, while refusals threaten the requester's positive face by implying rejection. Effective refusals employ strategies to minimize face threat through expressions of regret, explanations, or alternative offers, though the optimal strategy mix likely varies across cultural and situational contexts. The distinction between person-focused and request-focused rejection influences how refusals are interpreted. Person-focused rejection suggests the relationship or the individual is being rejected, while request-focused rejection indicates only that the specific request cannot be accommodated. Communication strategies that clearly establish request-focused framing may reduce relationship damage, though the cues that effectively convey this distinction remain inadequately specified. Assertiveness training programs teach refusal skills to individuals who experience difficulty declining requests. These programs typically emphasize the distinction between aggressive, passive, and assertive communication styles. However, the long-term effectiveness of assertiveness training and its generalization across diverse social contexts have received limited systematic evaluation. Cultural appropriateness of assertive refusal styles varies substantially, limiting the universal applicability of Western assertiveness models. The concept of social capital suggests that relationships provide access to resources and opportunities through network connections. Repeated refusals may deplete social capital by signaling unavailability or unwillingness to reciprocate. The relationship between refusal frequency, refusal style, and social capital maintenance has been theoretically proposed but empirically underexplored. Whether thoughtful refusal delivery can preserve social capital compared to simple rejection remains an open question. Rule 22. Step aside without being asked. Spatial behavior research examines how individuals navigate shared physical environments and manage proxemic boundaries. The concept of situational awareness in social contexts refers to the perception of environmental elements and their meaning, particularly regarding how one's position and movement affect others. Individual differences in situational awareness appear substantial, with some individuals showing high sensitivity to spatial impacts, while others demonstrate limited environmental monitoring. The psychological mechanisms underlying spatial courtesy behaviors may involve perspective taking, empathic concern, or internalized social norms. Whether these behaviors reflect effortful cognitive processes or automated habits developed through repeated practice remains unclear. The developmental trajectory through which individuals acquire spatial awareness and the factors that facilitate or impair this development have received limited systematic attention. Proxemics research identifies culturally variable norms regarding appropriate interpersonal distances and spatial arrangements. Some cultures maintain larger personal space bubbles and value individual spatial autonomy, while others tolerate closer proximity and emphasize collective space sharing. These cultural differences affect the interpretation of spatial behaviors, with actions considered courteous in one context potentially appearing unnecessary or even suspicious in another. The relationship between spatial behavior and social perception involves complex inference processes. Blocking passages or occupying excessive space may be interpreted as dominance displays, social obliviousness, or simple distraction. The ambiguity in these interpretations means that spatial violations may damage social standing without conscious awareness by either party. The extent to which spatial courtesy contributes to broader social reputation remains unquantified. Crowding research distinguishes between physical density and psychological crowding, with crowding representing the subjective experience of insufficient space. Individual differences in crowding tolerance relate to personality factors including introversion, extroversion, and need for personal space. High-density environments may produce stress responses including elevated cortisol, reduced frustration tolerance, and decreased prosocial behavior. Whether spatial courtesy behaviors mitigate crowding stress or merely represent normative compliance requires clarification. The concept of territorial behavior extends beyond spatial positioning to include resource control and ownership signaling. Humans display territorial behaviors through various mechanisms including physical occupation, symbolic marking, and defensive responses to intrusion. The relationship between everyday spatial courtesy and deeper territorial instincts remains theoretically underdeveloped. Whether stepping aside represents genuine altruism or merely strategic territory management cannot be determined from behavioral observation alone. Rule 23. Learn the lesson before labeling the day bad. Cognitive appraisal theory proposes that emotional responses to events depend not on objective circumstances but on subjective interpretations of those circumstances. The same event may produce different emotional outcomes depending on whether it is appraised as threatening versus challenging, or as controllable versus uncontrollable. The malleability of appraisal processes suggests potential leverage points for emotional regulation interventions. The concept of cognitive reappraisal refers to the reinterpretation of situations to alter their emotional impact. Reappraisal appears to be an effective emotion regulation strategy associated with better mental health outcomes compared to strategies like suppression or rumination. However, the mechanisms through which reappraisal produces these benefits and the boundary conditions limiting its effectiveness remain incompletely specified. Rumination involves repetitive focus on negative emotions and their causes without progression toward problem-solving or acceptance. This cognitive style appears strongly associated with depression and anxiety disorders. The factors that determine whether negative event processing leads to productive learning versus maladaptive rumination include controllability, perception, self-blame patterns, and dispositional tendencies. Interventions aimed at reducing rumination show mixed effectiveness. The distinction between event evaluation and day evaluation represents a temporal framing issue. Single negative events may be allowed to define entire time periods through a process of emotional contamination or negativity bias. The psychological mechanisms underlying this contamination and strategies to prevent it have received theoretical attention but limited empirical validation. Resilience research examines factors that enable individuals to maintain or rapidly regain psychological well-being following adversity. Cognitive flexibility, meaning-making, and growth mindset appear to contribute to resilience, though their relative importance and causal relationships remain debated. Whether resilience represents a stable trait or a dynamic process that varies across situations and developmental periods, affects intervention design and effectiveness expectations. The concept of benefit finding refers to the identification of positive consequences following negative events. This process appears common following major life adversities and may contribute to post-traumatic growth. However, the authenticity of benefit finding and its relationship to actual positive outcomes versus defensive coping remains controversial. The optimal timing for benefit finding attempts and risks of premature positive reframing require further investigation. Rule 24. Share clouds as often as sunshine. Self-disclosure theory examines the gradual revelation of personal information in relationship development. The social penetration model proposes that relationships progress through stages of increasing disclosure, depth, and breadth. Disclosure, reciprocity, where one person's revelation prompts similar sharing from others, appears to be a robust pattern facilitating relationship intimacy development. The psychological functions of sharing negative experiences include emotional ventilation, support mobilization, and meaning-making through narrative construction. However, disclosure of negative content carries risks, including perceived burdensomeness, stigma, activation, and relationship strain. The factors that determine whether negative disclosure strengthens or damages relationships include recipient responsiveness, disclosure, appropriateness, and frequency patterns. The concept of emotional contagion suggests that emotional states spread between individuals through automatic mimicry and physiological synchronization. Sharing negative emotions may therefore transmit distress to recipients, creating social costs that discourage disclosure. Whether these costs are offset by benefits of authentic connection and support access likely varies with relationship quality and cultural context. Cultural display rules govern which emotions are appropriate to express in different social contexts. Individualist cultures may encourage emotional expression as authentic self-presentation, while collectivist cultures may emphasize emotional restraint to maintain group harmony. These cultural differences affect both disclosure patterns and interpretations of disclosure, with behaviors considered healthy openness in one context potentially viewed as inappropriate burden sharing in another. The positivity bias in social media reflects a tendency to selectively share positive experiences while concealing negative ones. This pattern may create distorted social comparison processes where individuals compare their complete lives, including failures, to others' curated highlights. The psychological consequences of positivity-biased social comparison include reduced well-being, envy, and loneliness. Whether encouraging more balanced disclosure online produces benefits or merely spreads negativity remains debated. The concept of strategic authenticity involves selective revelation of true thoughts and feelings based on contextual appropriateness. This practice contrasts with both complete authenticity regardless of context and complete inauthenticity through constant impression management. The optimal balance between authenticity and strategic self-presentation likely varies across relationships and situations in ways that defy simple prescription. The psychological consequences of sustained strategic inauthenticity may include identity confusion and emotional exhaustion. Rule 25. Coach in private, praise in public. Feedback delivery research distinguishes between public and private contexts in terms of their psychological impacts. Public feedback occurs in the presence of witnesses who may form or revise impressions based on observed interactions. The presence of an audience appears to intensify emotional responses to both positive and negative feedback through mechanisms including social evaluation, concern, and self-presentation motivation. The concept of face-saving refers to avoiding actions that threaten another's public self-image. Public criticism threatens face by exposing flaws or mistakes to witnesses, potentially damaging social status and triggering shame responses. Private criticism provides opportunity for face-saving by containing negative information and allowing behavioral adjustment without public humiliation. The importance of face-saving varies across cultures, with collectivist cultures showing particularly strong concern for face maintenance. Social comparison theory proposes that individuals evaluate their abilities and characteristics by comparing themselves to others. Public praise establishes favorable comparisons that enhance self-esteem, while public criticism establishes unfavorable comparisons that threaten self-worth. The impact of social comparison depends on comparison target characteristics and individual differences in comparison orientation. The optimal balance between public and private feedback may depend on organizational culture and individual preferences. Some high-performing organizations embrace public accountability, including visible feedback, while others prioritize psychological safety through private correction. Individual differences in feedback-seeking behavior and shame-proneness suggest that feedback delivery preferences vary substantially. Whether universally applicable feedback delivery rules exist or whether strategies must be individually tailored remains unresolved. The relationship between feedback delivery method and learning effectiveness involves complex psychological processes. Public criticism may impair learning through anxiety elevation and cognitive resource depletion, while private feedback allows calm processing. However, public accountability may enhance motivation and commitment to improvement. The net effect on learning and performance likely depends on multiple moderating factors, including task complexity and individual achievement orientation. The concept of psychological safety in groups refers to the shared belief that interpersonal risk-taking is acceptable. Public criticism by leaders may reduce psychological safety by establishing norms of judgment and punishment for errors. This reduction may subsequently impair team learning, innovation, and performance through reduced information sharing and experimentation. The relationship between leader feedback practices and team psychological safety has been documented, but causal mechanisms remain incompletely specified. Rule 26. Don't tease someone who's already shrinking. Social status dynamics involve hierarchical ordering of individuals based on competence, dominance, or prestige. Status threats occur when individuals receive information suggesting status loss or inferiority. Psychological responses to status threats include defensive self-enhancement, aggression, and withdrawal. The intensity of threat responses appears related to status, instability, and importance of the threatened domain to self-concept. The concept of social anxiety refers to fear of negative evaluation in social situations. Individuals high in social anxiety show heightened sensitivity to potential rejection or criticism and may engage in safety behaviors including self-concealment and avoidance. Teasing or humor directed at socially anxious individuals may trigger disproportionate threat responses due to interpretation biases and elevated baseline vigilance for social danger signals. Humor research distinguishes between affiliative humor that builds connection and aggressive humor that establishes dominance or expresses hostility. The same verbal content may serve different functions depending on context and relationship. Teasing occupies an ambiguous position between these humor types. potentially interpreted as playful bonding or veiled aggression depending on recipient state and relationship history. The concept of benign versus malicious envy distinguishes between motivational responses to upward social comparison. Benign envy involves admiration and motivation for self-improvement, while malicious envy involves resentment and desire to harm the superior other. Teasing may activate either envy type depending on delivery style and recipient interpretation. The factors determining which envy form is activated remain inadequately specified. Emotional intelligence involves accurate perception of others' emotional states and appropriate response calibration. The ability to detect when others are experiencing vulnerability or distress and to modulate behavior accordingly represents an important component of emotional intelligence. Individual differences in this ability appear substantial, with some individuals showing high sensitivity while others demonstrate limited emotional perception. Whether emotional intelligence can be developed through training or represents stable individual differences remains debated. The concept of relational aggression refers to harm inflicted through relationship manipulation, including exclusion, gossip, and public humiliation. Teasing vulnerable individuals may constitute a form of relational aggression regardless of intention. The psychological impacts of relational aggression can be severe, including anxiety, depression, and social withdrawal. Whether perpetrators recognize the aggressive nature of their behavior or perceive it as harmless interaction represents an important question for intervention design. Rule 27. If it's not yours, don't take it. If it's private, don't share it. Property psychology examines how individuals develop concepts of ownership and respond to ownership violations. Research suggests that ownership emerges early in development and involves strong emotional reactions to dispossession. The psychological experience of ownership extends beyond legal rights to include feelings of possession toward objects, ideas, and information. Privacy theory distinguishes between multiple privacy dimensions, including physical privacy, informational privacy, and psychological privacy. Informational privacy refers to control over personal information distribution. Privacy violations through unauthorized information sharing may produce psychological distress through multiple mechanisms, including autonomy threat, reputation damage, and trust betrayal. The concept of psychological ownership refers to feelings of possession toward targets, including material objects, ideas, territories, and relationships. This ownership feeling appears to arise through three primary routes: controlling the target, coming to know the target intimately, and investing oneself in the target. Psychological ownership produces protective motivations and territorial behaviors similar to legal ownership. Trust constitutes a fundamental element in close relationships, involving expectations that others will act in one's interests and not exploit vulnerability. Confidentiality violations directly damage trust by demonstrating unreliability and disregard for privacy boundaries. The repair of damaged trust appears difficult and time-consuming, with some research suggesting that trust restoration never reaches pre-violation levels. The factors that facilitate versus impede trust repair remain incompletely identified. Gossip research examines the sharing of information about absent third parties. While often viewed negatively, gossip serves social functions including norm enforcement, relationship bonding, and information distribution. The distinction between harmful and harmless gossip depends on factors including information accuracy, subject vulnerability, and sharing motivation. However, The boundaries between these gossip types remain subjectively defined and culturally variable. The concept of moral ownership refers to perceived rights to control information or objects based on ethical principles rather than legal entitlement. Individuals may feel moral ownership of personal stories, creative ideas, or confidential information shared in trust. Violations of moral ownership may produce outrage and moral condemnation even in absence of legal violation. The relationship between moral and legal ownership concepts and their cultural variability require further investigation. Rule 28. Apologize without a paragraph. Apology research examines the components of effective apologies and their psychological functions. Core apology elements include acknowledgement of offense, acceptance of responsibility, expression of remorse, and commitment to behavioral change. The relative importance of these components and optimal apology structure appear to vary across offense types and cultural contexts. The psychological functions of apologies include relationship repair, norm reaffirmation, and emotion regulation for both offender and victim. Apologies signal recognition of wrongdoing and concern for the relationship, potentially reducing victim anger and facilitating forgiveness. However, apology effectiveness depends on sincerity, perception, with defensive or excuse-laden apologies often producing negative reactions. The concept of accounts refers to explanations individuals provide for problematic behaviors. Account types include excuses that deny responsibility, justifications that deny wrongfulness, and confessions that accept both responsibility and wrongfulness. Research suggests confessions produce more favorable responses than excuses or justifications, though this pattern may be moderated by offense severity and relationship factors. Verbosity in apologies may signal either thoroughness and sincerity or defensiveness and excuse-making. The interpretation likely depends on content structure, with explanations preceding acknowledgement appearing more defensive than those following clear responsibility acceptance. The optimal apology length and structure have not been empirically determined and may vary with offense characteristics and individual preferences. Cultural variation in apology practices complicates universal prescription. Some cultures emphasize elaborate apologies with repeated expressions of remorse, while others value brief acknowledgement and rapid return to normalcy. These cultural differences reflect varying beliefs about appropriate emotional expression, relationship maintenance, and social harmony preservation. The effectiveness of apology styles likely depends on cultural context match between apologizer and recipient. The concept of defensive attribution involves biasing causal explanations to protect self-esteem or avoid blame. Apologies contaminated with defensive attributions through excessive explanation or blame shifting may fail to achieve their intended functions. The psychological difficulty of overcoming defensive attribution tendencies and delivering clean apologies represents a significant challenge. Whether individuals can be trained to recognize and suppress defensive attribution in apology contexts remains an open question. Rule 29. Try to play positive sum games only. Game theory provides mathematical frameworks for analyzing strategic interactions where outcomes depend on multiple parties' choices. Zero-sum games involve fixed resources where one party's gain equals another's loss, while positive-sum games allow mutual gain through cooperation or resource expansion. The applicability of game theory models to real human interaction depends on assumptions about rationality and goal structure that may not hold in practice. The concept of integrative bargaining contrasts with distributive bargaining by focusing on expanding the total value available rather than claiming larger shares of fixed resources. Integrative bargaining requires information sharing, creative problem solving, and trust that shared information will not be exploited. The conditions enabling successful integrative bargaining include multiple negotiable issues, differing priorities across parties, and sufficient relationship quality to enable vulnerability. Prisoner's dilemma scenarios demonstrate how individual rationality can produce collectively suboptimal outcomes when cooperation is risky. These scenarios appear relevant to numerous real-world interactions including public goods provision, environmental protection, and relationship maintenance. The factors enabling cooperation in prisoner's dilemma situations include communication opportunity, repeated interaction, and reputation concerns, though the relative importance of these factors varies across contexts. Social value orientation refers to stable preferences regarding outcome distribution between self and others. Pro-self individuals prioritize maximizing personal outcomes, while pro-social individuals consider both personal and others' outcomes or aim for equality. These orientations appear relatively stable individual differences that predict cooperative behavior across diverse situations. The developmental origins of social value orientation and potential for intervention-based change remain incompletely understood. The concept of enlightened self-interest proposes that cooperation may serve long-term personal interests, even when imposing short-term costs. Reputation benefits, relationship development, and reciprocity expectations may make cooperative strategies rational from an individualistic perspective. However, the conditions under which enlightened self-interest produces cooperation versus when defection remains optimal have not been fully specified. The tension between short-term and long-term optimization presents ongoing strategic challenges. Evolutionary psychology perspectives on cooperation emphasize mechanisms including kin selection, reciprocal altruism, and group selection that may have shaped human cooperative tendencies. These perspectives suggest that cooperation may be conditionally adaptive, depending on genetic relatedness, probability of future interaction, and group competition dynamics. The extent to which evolutionary mechanisms constrain or enable cooperative behavior in modern contexts where ancestral conditions may not apply remains controversial. Rule 30. Let people arrive at their own speed. Individual differences in processing speed, social comfort, and relationship development pacing appear substantial. Attachment theory proposes that early relationship experiences with caregivers shape internal working models affecting adult relationship formation. Individuals with secure attachment tend to be comfortable with intimacy and autonomy, while those with anxious or avoidant attachment show different relationship approach patterns involving either pursuit or distance. The concept of introversion-extroversion represents a fundamental personality dimension affecting social behavior. Introverted individuals show lower optimal arousal levels and may become overstimulated in high-intensity social environments, while extroverted individuals seek stimulation and thrive in active social contexts. These differences affect pacing preferences for relationship development and social engagement. Social anxiety involves fear of negative evaluation and concerns about social performance. Individuals high in social anxiety may require extended observation periods before active participation in group settings. Pressure to engage before achieving comfort may increase anxiety and potentially trigger avoidance. The optimal approach for facilitating anxious individuals' social integration remains uncertain, with both gradual exposure and immediate immersion approaches showing varied effectiveness. Cultural differences in appropriate relationship development pacing reflect varying values regarding intimacy, trust, and social obligations. Some cultures emphasize rapid relationship formation with immediate warmth and openness, while others value gradual trust building through extended observation and testing. These cultural differences affect interpretation of pacing preferences, with behaviors considered appropriate patience in one context potentially appearing as coldness or disinterest in another. The concept of psychological safety in groups refers to shared beliefs about interpersonal risk acceptance. Creating psychological safety may require allowing varied engagement paces without pressure or judgment. However, the tension between accommodating slow integrators and maintaining group energy and cohesion presents practical challenges. The optimal balance between inclusion, patience, and engagement encouragement has not been empirically determined. Development of social skills and confidence often follows non-linear trajectories with periods of rapid growth and plateaus. Late bloomers who develop social capacities later than peers may face cumulative disadvantages through missed developmental experiences and negative social feedback. Whether social skills can be developed at any age or whether critical developmental windows exist remains debated. The factors enabling versus constraining adult social skill development require further investigation to inform intervention approaches. Rule 31. Say goodbye like it might be remembered. Memory research identifies recency effects where final elements in sequences receive disproportionate encoding and recall relative to middle elements. In social interactions, closing exchanges may carry particular weight in memory consolidation and relationship evaluation. The psychological mechanisms underlying farewell significance may involve emotional arousal during separation, cognitive salience of endings, or narrative structure preferences in autobiographical memory. The peak end rule describes a memory heuristic where retrospective evaluations of experiences depend heavily on peak intensity moments and final moments rather than average experience quality. Research using this framework suggests that interaction endings substantially influence overall relationship judgments. However, the applicability of laboratory-derived findings to naturalistic relationship contexts remains uncertain, particularly for relationships extending over years or decades where numerous endings occur. Farewell communication serves multiple functions including relationship definition, future interaction framing, and emotional regulation during separation. The specific verbal and nonverbal behaviors constituting effective farewells likely vary across relationship types and cultural contexts. Some cultures emphasize elaborate farewell rituals with explicit emotional expression, while others value brevity and emotional restraint. These variations complicate attempts to identify universally optimal farewell strategies. The concept of leave-taking rituals refers to structured behavioral sequences marking transition points in relationships or interactions. Anthropological research documents substantial cross-cultural variation in leave-taking practices, suggesting that these behaviors carry symbolic meaning beyond immediate communicative function. Whether deliberate attention to farewell quality produces measurable relationship benefits, or whether farewell significance is retrospectively constructed has not been empirically established. Mortality salience research examines how awareness of death affects psychological processes and behavior. The recognition that any farewell could theoretically be final may activate existential concerns that intensify emotional responses and behavioral deliberation. However, the practical frequency with which individuals engage such mortality awareness during routine farewells appears low. The conditions under which mortality considerations influence daily social behavior versus remain abstract background knowledge require clarification. The relationship between farewell quality and subsequent relationship trajectories involves bidirectional causation challenges. High-quality farewells may indicate strong relationships that would persist regardless, rather than causing relationship maintenance. Alternatively, deliberate farewell attention may strengthen relationships through multiple mechanisms, including positive emotion generation, commitment signaling, and memory consolidation. Experimental designs capable of isolating farewell effects from relationship quality confounds have not been implemented in this research domain. Rule 32. Treat your future self as a friend you care about. Temporal discounting refers to the tendency to devalue outcomes occurring in the future relative to immediate outcomes. This discounting appears hyperbolic rather than exponential, with particularly steep devaluation of near-future outcomes. The psychological mechanisms underlying temporal discounting may involve limitations in prospective imagination, uncertainty about future states, or evolved preferences for immediate resource acquisition. Individual differences in discount rates appear substantial and correlate with various life outcomes, including financial security and health behaviors. Construal level theory proposes that psychological distance, including temporal distance, affects how events are mentally represented. Distant events are construed abstractly, focusing on essential features, while near events are construed concretely, emphasizing contextual details. This framework suggests that future self-representations may be abstract and decontextualized in ways that reduce emotional connection and behavioral influence. Whether interventions targeting construal level can enhance future self-consideration remains an active research question. The concept of affective forecasting refers to predictions about future emotional states. Research consistently demonstrates affective forecasting errors, with individuals overestimating intensity and duration of future emotions. These forecasting errors may contribute to suboptimal decision-making by distorting perceived future consequences. The specific mechanisms producing forecasting errors include focalism, immune neglect, and projection bias, though their relative contributions vary across prediction types. Self-continuity refers to the perception that one's past, present, and future selves constitute a coherent, persistent identity. Individual differences in self-continuity perception appear to influence future-oriented behavior, with higher continuity associated with greater consideration of long-term consequences. However, the causal direction of this relationship remains unclear. Whether enhancing self-continuity perception through intervention produces downstream behavioral benefits represents an untested hypothesis. Ego depletion theory, though controversial, proposes that self-control draws on limited resources that become temporarily exhausted through use. Present-focused decisions may result from depleted regulatory capacity rather than stable preference structures. If valid, this framework suggests that future self-consideration may vary with regulatory resource availability. Recent replication failures and meta-analytic debates have cast doubt on ego depletion mechanisms, leaving the field without consensus regarding self-control resource models. The relationship between self-compassion and future-oriented behavior presents paradoxical elements. Self-compassion involves treating oneself with kindness during difficulty, which might seem to encourage present indulgence. However, research suggests self-compassionate individuals show better long-term goal pursuit, possibly because self-compassion reduces defensive reactions to setbacks. The mechanisms through which self-compassion influences temporal orientation and the boundary conditions limiting these effects require further specification. Rule 33. Celebrate micro wins, they fuel macro ones. Goal-setting theory proposes that specific, challenging goals enhance performance through multiple mechanisms, including attention, direction, effort, mobilization, and strategy development. The subdivision of large goals into intermediate milestones appears to enhance progress through increased feedback frequency and reduced temporal discounting. However, the optimal granularity of goal decomposition likely varies with task characteristics and individual preferences in ways that resist universal prescription. The concept of progress monitoring refers to systematic tracking of advancement toward objectives. Feedback intervention theory suggests that attention to progress can either enhance or impair performance, depending on whether it is interpreted as indicating satisfactory versus unsatisfactory advancement. The factors determining feedback interpretation include individual goal commitment, self-efficacy levels, and feedback framing. The relationship between monitoring frequency and performance appears curvilinear, with both insufficient and excessive monitoring potentially impairing outcomes. Small wins theory proposes that manageable accomplishments produce psychological benefits, including enhanced self-efficacy, positive affect, and momentum toward larger objectives. The recognition and celebration of incremental progress may activate reward pathways that reinforce continued effort. However, the distinction between genuine progress markers and artificial milestone creation introduces complexity. Whether celebrating arbitrary progress points provides similar benefits to acknowledging objectively significant achievements remains unclear. The concept of learned industriousness proposes that reward for high-effort activities can condition effort itself to acquire secondary reinforcing properties. This framework suggests that celebration of effortful small wins might increase intrinsic motivation for sustained effort. However, the conditions enabling versus preventing such conditioning and the stability of learned industriousness across contexts have not been comprehensively mapped. Social comparison processes affect interpretation of personal accomplishments. In competitive environments, individual progress may be overshadowed by relative standing concerns, reducing small win satisfaction. Alternatively, collaborative contexts may enable shared celebration that amplifies individual accomplishment significance. The social context's influence on small win psychological impact and the optimal strategies for managing comparison processes require further investigation. The relationship between celebration practices and hedonic adaptation presents theoretical tension. Hedonic adaptation refers to the tendency for emotional responses to return to baseline following changes in circumstances. Frequent celebration of small wins might accelerate adaptation and reduce the motivational power of achievement. Alternatively, mindful appreciation practices might counteract adaptation through sustained attention to positive experiences. The interaction between celebration, frequency, mindfulness, and hedonic adaptation remains empirically unresolved. Rule 34. don't finish their sentence if it costs them courage. Speech production research identifies multiple cognitive stages, including conceptualization, formulation, and articulation. Difficulties at any stage may produce hesitations, false starts, or incomplete utterances. The psychological experience of struggling to express thoughts appears particularly acute when content involves emotional vulnerability or social risk. Observer interventions during these struggles may either facilitate communication or prematurely foreclose authentic expression. The concept of communicative accommodation refers to adjustments speakers and listeners make to converge toward or diverge from each other's communication styles. Sentence completion represents a form of convergence where listeners demonstrate understanding by anticipating speaker intent. However, this practice may also signal impatience or dismiss the importance of the speaker's specific word choices and pacing. The interpretation of sentence completion likely varies with relationship quality and communication context. Social anxiety involves fear of negative evaluation during social performance, with public speaking representing a prototypical anxiety-provoking situation. Individuals high in social anxiety may experience sentence completion as confirming feared evaluations of inadequacy or unworthiness of attention. Alternatively, assistance during speech difficulties might be perceived as supportive, depending on delivery style and relationship context. The factors determining whether interruptions are experienced as helpful versus threatening require empirical specification. The concept of scaffolding in educational contexts refers to temporary support structures that facilitate learning while being gradually withdrawn as competence develops. Applied to communication, sentence completion might serve scaffolding functions by reducing immediate performance demands while maintaining communication flow. However, excessive scaffolding may impair competence development by preventing learners from struggling productively with challenging tasks. The optimal balance between support and challenge in conversational contexts remains undefined. Power dynamics in conversation influence interruption patterns, with high-power individuals showing greater tendency to interrupt low-power individuals than the reverse. Sentence completion may function as a subtle dominance display by claiming authority to determine conversational direction and content. The relationship between sentence completion frequency, power dynamics, and conversational satisfaction has been noted but not systematically studied across diverse relationship types. The distinction between cooperative overlapping speech and competitive interruption represents a cultural variable. Some linguistic communities treat overlapping speech as engagement and enthusiasm signals, while others interpret it as rude interruption. These cultural differences affect the meaning and appropriateness of sentence completion behaviors. The ability to recognize and adapt to varying cultural norms regarding turn-taking and speech overlap represents a dimension of intercultural communication competence. Rule 35. Text when you're late, even by 5 minutes. Punctuality norms vary substantially across cultures, with some emphasizing precise time adherence while others tolerate flexible scheduling. These differences appear linked to broader cultural values, including polychronic versus monochronic time orientation. Polychronic cultures view time as fluid and emphasize relationship maintenance over schedule adherence, while monochronic cultures treat time as segmented commodity requiring precise management. The psychological experience of waiting and lateness interpretation vary correspondingly across these cultural frameworks. The concept of social contracts involves implicit mutual expectations governing interaction. Scheduled meetings create temporal contracts where parties agree to coordinate presence at specified times. Violation of these contracts without notification may be perceived as disrespect, unreliability, or low relationship priority. The severity of perceived violation likely depends on lateness, magnitude, frequency, explanation quality, and relationship context. Waiting psychology examines subjective time perception and emotional responses during delay periods. Research suggests that uncertain waits feel longer than waits with known durations, and unoccupied waits feel longer than occupied waits. Communication regarding lateness may reduce uncertainty and provide cognitive occupation through consideration of explanations, thereby mitigating negative waiting experiences. However, the magnitude of these effects and their variation across individual differences in patients remain inadequately quantified. Technology availability has transformed lateness communication norms, with mobile devices enabling real-time status updates. The expectation that late individuals will provide notification has intensified as communication barriers have diminished. This technological shift may have reduced tolerance for unexplained lateness while simultaneously making communication easier. The evolution of punctuality norms in response to communication technology and the variation in these norms across demographic groups represent underexplored research areas. The relationship between lateness patterns and personality dimensions has received empirical attention. Chronic lateness correlates with conscientiousness levels, with low conscientiousness individuals showing greater difficulty with time management and punctuality. However, situational factors, including competing demands, travel uncertainty, and optimistic time estimation, also contribute to lateness. The relative contribution of dispositional versus situational factors and the effectiveness of interventions targeting different factors remain unresolved questions. Notification of lateness involves self-disclosure of failure to meet obligations. This disclosure may activate impression management concerns and motivate excuse provision or blame externalization. The balance between honest explanation and face-saving in lateness communication presents ongoing tension. Research on accounts and excuse-making suggests that external attribution protects self-esteem but may damage credibility if implausible. The optimal communication strategy likely varies with relationship type and lateness cause. Rule 36. Too many yeses become self-betrayal. The concept of boundary diffusion refers to the erosion of limits between self and others, or between different life domains. Excessive accommodation of others' requests may produce boundary diffusion through cumulative time and energy depletion. The psychological consequences of boundary violations include resentment, identity, confusion, and burnout. However, the threshold at which helpful responsiveness becomes harmful, self-neglect, likely varies across individuals based on personality, capacity, and value structures. Self-determination theory proposes that human motivation depends on satisfaction of basic psychological needs, including autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Autonomy involves experiencing behavior as self-endorsed and volitional. Repeated agreement to requests that conflict with personal preferences or values may undermine autonomy, satisfaction, producing reduced intrinsic motivation and psychological well-being. The relationship between accommodation patterns and need satisfaction has been theoretically proposed but requires more direct empirical examination. The concept of ego depletion, controversial though it is, suggests that self-control draws on limited resources. If this model is accurate, then the effort required to fulfill unwanted commitments may deplete regulatory resources, impairing subsequent self-control in other domains. Alternative models propose that perceived effort expenditure rather than actual depletion explains performance decrements. Regardless of mechanism, the experience of excessive obligation appears psychologically costly. People-pleasing behavior involves prioritizing others' preferences and approval over personal needs and authentic preferences. This pattern may develop through reinforcement histories where approval is contingent on accommodation, or through aversive conditioning where refusal produces punishment. People-pleasing appears associated with external locus of control, low self-esteem, and anxious attachment. Whether these associations reflect causal relationships or common underlying factors remains unclear. The relationship between accommodation and relationship quality appears curvilinear. Moderate responsiveness to others' needs correlates with relationship satisfaction, but excessive self-sacrifice may produce resentment and relationship deterioration. The optimal balance likely varies across relationship types, with communal relationships tolerating greater flexibility than exchange relationships. Cultural factors influence these patterns, with collectivist cultures potentially supporting higher accommodation levels than individualist cultures. Authenticity involves alignment between internal experience and external expression. Persistent agreement to requests that conflict with personal values or desires creates authenticity deficits. The psychological costs of inauthenticity include emotional labor, identity confusion, and reduced life satisfaction. However, some degree of strategic self-presentation appears necessary for social functioning. The distinction between adaptive social flexibility and maladaptive self-betrayal remains subjectively defined and context-dependent. Rule 37. Humor that lands on you first never hurts others. Self-deprecating humor involves highlighting personal flaws or failures for comedic effect. This humor style appears to serve multiple social functions including modesty signaling, tension reduction, and preemptive defense against criticism. However, the psychological impacts of self-deprecating humor show complex patterns depending on frequency, intensity, and individual difference factors. The relationship between self-deprecating humor and self-esteem presents paradoxical elements. Some research suggests that self-deprecating humor from high self-esteem individuals is perceived as confident, while identical humor from low self-esteem individuals reinforces negative self-perception. This pattern suggests that self-deprecating humor may function differently depending on underlying self-concept security. Whether self-deprecating humor causes or reflects self-esteem levels cannot be determined from correlational research. Social comparison theory proposes that self-evaluation occurs partly through comparison with others. Self-deprecating humor that positions oneself as inferior may serve affiliative functions by reducing perceived threat and enabling upward comparison for others. This downward positioning might enhance likability while potentially damaging respect or status. The trade-offs between these competing outcomes and their variation across contexts remain inadequately mapped. The concept of benign masochism refers to enjoying initially aversive experiences after recognizing their safety. Self-deprecating humor may represent a form of benign masochism where individuals playfully engage with personal shortcomings after determining they pose no genuine threat. This practice might facilitate emotional resilience through exposure-based desensitization. However, The boundary between productive self-acceptance and maladaptive self-criticism remains unclear. Gender differences in self-deprecating humor patterns have been documented, with some research suggesting women use self-deprecating humor more frequently than men. These patterns may reflect gendered socialization regarding modesty, status management, and emotional expression. Whether these differences represent stable cultural patterns or changing norms remains uncertain. The psychological consequences of self-deprecating humor may also vary by gender due to different social status dynamics and evaluation standards. The distinction between self-deprecating humor and self-criticism involves intent and framing. Humor involves playful, exaggerated presentation with expectation of laughter, while criticism involves serious evaluation with negative valence. However, the boundary between these categories is subjective and may shift based on tone, context, and recipient interpretation. Excessive self-deprecating humor may blur into genuine self-criticism with corresponding psychological costs. Rule 38. Keep your bag off the seat someone else could use. Commons Dilemma research examines situations where individual convenience competes with collective welfare. Occupying public space with personal belongings represents a micro-level commons problem where individual comfort gain produces collective capacity reduction. The psychological processes underlying these decisions include social value orientation, situational awareness, and norm perception. The concept of territorial behavior extends to temporary space occupation in public settings. Humans display territorial tendencies through various mechanisms, including physical occupation, symbolic marking, and defensive responses to intrusion. Bag placement on adjacent seats may function as territorial marking that signals unavailability. The strength of territorial impulses and their interaction with prosocial motivation likely varies across individuals and contexts. Social density research distinguishes between physical density and experienced crowding. High-density environments may trigger stress responses and reduced prosocial behavior through multiple mechanisms, including control threat, overstimulation, and anonymity. Whether space-sharing behaviors like bag removal are maintained under high-density stress or whether they decay as environmental demands increase represents an empirical question with practical implications for public space. Design. The relationship between visible need and helping behavior suggests that space sharing may increase when other passengers are obviously present and seeking seats. The psychological mechanisms underlying this effect may include empathic arousal, social pressure, or norm salience. However, individual differences in social attention and empathic responsiveness produce substantial variability in prosocial behavior even under high-need visibility. Cultural norms regarding personal space and public behavior vary substantially. Some cultures emphasize individual spatial autonomy and may view bag placement as appropriate boundary maintenance, while others prioritize collective access and view such behavior as selfish. These cultural differences affect both behavior frequency and interpretation. The ability to recognize and adapt to varying cultural expectations represents a dimension of cultural intelligence. The concept of broken windows theory proposes that visible signs of disorder encourage additional norm violations through social proof and reduced monitoring expectations. Public spaces with widespread territorial behaviors like bag placement may signal reduced norm enforcement, potentially encouraging similar behaviors in others. However, Empirical support for broken windows mechanisms remains controversial, with alternative explanations emphasizing selection effects rather than contagion. Rule 39. Let absence teach you as much as presence. Counterfactual thinking involves imagining alternative outcomes to actual events. This cognitive process appears fundamental to learning from experience and planning for the future. The absence of expected individuals or experiences may trigger counterfactual processing that highlights their value through contrast. However, the conditions that promote productive counterfactual thinking versus rumination or regret remain incompletely specified. The concept of hedonic adaptation refers to the tendency for emotional responses to positive circumstances to diminish over time as individuals adjust to new baselines. Presence of positive relationship elements may undergo hedonic adaptation, reducing their perceived value. Temporary absence may counteract adaptation by restoring novelty and salience. The relationship between absence, frequency, duration, and its effects on appreciation remains inadequately quantified. Attachment theory proposes that separation from attachment figures activates anxiety responses, particularly in individuals with anxious attachment styles. Brief separations may strengthen attachment bonds through reunion experiences, while prolonged separations may damage relationships through withdrawal or avoidance. The optimal separation patterns for relationship maintenance likely vary with attachment style, relationship stage, and separation circumstances. Social comparison processes affect relationship evaluation. In the presence of relationship partners, attention focuses on immediate interaction quality. In absence, comparison with alternative relationship possibilities or general life satisfaction may become more salient. Whether absence produces positive reassessment through comparison with inferior alternatives or negative reassessment through idealized alternative consideration likely depends on relationship quality and individual comparison. Orientation. The mere exposure effect describes increased preference for stimuli following repeated exposure. This effect might suggest that constant presence would maximize liking. However, research also documents satiation effects where excessive exposure reduces preference. The interaction between these opposing processes and the optimal exposure frequency for maximizing relationship satisfaction remain unclear. Individual differences in need for novelty versus familiarity likely moderate optimal contact patterns. Learning from absence requires metacognitive awareness of emotional shifts during separation. Many individuals may experience absence effects without conscious recognition of their significance. Whether explicit attention to absence-induced feelings enhances their informational value, or whether such attention produces artificial conclusions disconnected from natural emotional responses, represents an unresolved question in emotional intelligence research. Rule 40. A pun at the right moment is diplomacy. Humor serves multiple social functions including tension reduction, face saving, and indirect communication of sensitive content. The strategic deployment of humor in potentially conflictual situations may enable message delivery that would be rejected if presented seriously. However, the effectiveness of humor as diplomatic tool depends on multiple factors, including relationship quality, humor, skill, and cultural context. The concept of face-threatening acts refers to communication that risks damaging interactants' public self-images. Direct criticism or disagreement poses high face threat. Humor may mitigate face threat through multiple mechanisms including playfulness, framing, indirectness, and positive affect generation. The optimal balance between message clarity and face protection likely varies across cultures and situations. Puns represent a specific humor form involving wordplay and double meanings. The cognitive processing of puns appears to engage both semantic processing and pragmatic inference systems. Successful pun comprehension requires linguistic knowledge, contextual awareness, and processing flexibility. Individual differences in pun appreciation relate to personality factors including openness to experience and need for cognition. The timing of humor interventions appears critical to their effectiveness. Premature humor before tensions fully emerge may appear tone-deaf or dismissive, while delayed humor after escalation may be rejected or misinterpreted. The optimal timing likely depends on factors including emotional intensity, relationship quality, and cultural norms regarding appropriate emotional expression. The identification of optimal humor timing represents a form of social intelligence that appears highly variable across individuals. Cultural variation in humor appreciation complicates cross-cultural application of humor as diplomatic tool. Humor forms valued in one culture may be incomprehensible or offensive in another. The relationship between cultural distance and humor effectiveness has been noted but not systematically studied. The risks of humor misfire in intercultural contexts may exceed potential diplomatic benefits. The relationship between humor and power dynamics shows complex patterns. High-status individuals may use humor more freely with lower risk of negative interpretation, while low-status humor attempts may be viewed as inappropriate or threatening. Humor that challenges power structures may be perceived as either cleverly subversive or dangerously disrespectful depending on organizational culture and delivery skill. These dynamics introduce substantial risk into humor deployment as diplomatic strategy. Emotional intelligence as a construct encompasses multiple proposed abilities, including emotion perception, emotion understanding, emotion facilitation of thought, and emotion management. The specific cognitive and affective processes underlying these abilities and their relationships to social effectiveness remain subjects of theoretical debate. Competing models propose emotional intelligence as either a set of learnable skills or relatively stable individual differences reflecting underlying personality and cognitive capacities. The extent to which emotional intelligence can be enhanced through intervention versus representing fixed characteristics affects both research approaches and practical application possibilities. The concept of psychological vulnerability refers to states of emotional exposure where rejection, criticism, or abandonment could produce significant psychological harm. Vulnerability may arise in multiple contexts, including disclosure of personal information, requests for help, expressions of affection, or acknowledgement of mistakes. The decision-making processes governing when and how individuals accept vulnerability involve complex risk assessments that integrate relationship history, situational factors, and individual differences in risk tolerance and attachment security. Rule 41. Pain isn't a contest. Never one-up vulnerability. Competitive social comparison involves evaluating personal standing relative to others across valued dimensions. When applied to suffering or hardship, competitive comparison may produce behaviors where individuals claim greater difficulties than conversational partners. This pattern may reflect multiple underlying motivations, including attention-seeking, status competition through victimhood, or genuine attempts to establish common ground through shared experience acknowledgement. The concept of empathic failure describes situations where intended supportive responses produce opposite effects by invalidating the recipient's experience. One-upping disclosures of pain may constitute empathic failure by shifting focus from the original discloser's experience to the responder's competing narrative. The psychological impact may include feelings of dismissal, competitive inadequacy, or reluctance to pursue further disclosure. However, the interpretation of comparative disclosures likely depends on delivery style, relationship context, and cultural norms regarding appropriate support provision. Conversational turn-taking norms involve complex implicit rules about when topic shifts are appropriate. Premature redirection from another's disclosure to one's own experience may violate turn-taking expectations even when the content appears topically relevant. The psychological processes underlying turn-taking, violation detection, and their relationship to perceived support quality have received limited systematic attention. The boundary between appropriate reciprocal disclosure and inappropriate topic hijacking remains subjectively defined. The concept of social support encompasses multiple distinct functions, including emotional support involving empathy and validation, informational support involving advice and guidance, and instrumental support involving practical assistance. Different support types may be appropriate for different situations. Comparative suffering disclosures may represent misguided attempts to provide emotional support through demonstrated understanding, though they fail to achieve validation effects. The factors enabling accurate support type matching to recipient needs represent an important dimension of support provision effectiveness. Suffering Olympics refers colloquially to competitive exchanges where participants implicitly or explicitly compete to establish who has experienced greater hardship. These patterns may emerge in various contexts, including trauma survivor communities, caregiving relationships, or workplace complaints. The psychological functions of such competition may include status seeking, identity construction around suffering, or defensive minimization of others' difficulties. Whether these patterns serve any adaptive purposes or represent purely maladaptive social dynamics remains unclear. The relationship between personal experience, disclosure, and empathic accuracy presents paradoxical elements. Sharing similar experiences might enhance understanding through increased perspective-taking accuracy. However, projection biases may lead to erroneous assumptions that others' experiences match one's own. The conditions under which personal experience enhances versus impairs empathic accuracy require specification. The optimal balance between self-disclosure and attentive listening in support provision likely varies across situations and relationship types. Rule 42. Be the one who notices. Attentional control refers to the ability to direct cognitive resources toward task-relevant stimuli while filtering distractions. Individual differences in attentional control capacity appear substantial and relate to working memory capacity, inhibitory control, and executive function. The application of attentional resources to social information versus other domains represents a strategic choice influenced by motivation, habit, and capacity constraints. The concept of social attention distinguishes between attention directed toward social versus non-social stimuli. Research suggests individual differences in social attention relate to social competence outcomes, with greater social attention generally associated with better relationship quality. However, excessive social attention without corresponding self-focus might produce difficulties with autonomy and identity maintenance. The optimal balance between social and self-directed attention likely varies across individuals and situations. Mindfulness as a construct emphasizes present moment awareness without judgment. Applied to social contexts, mindfulness might enhance noticing through reduced cognitive elaboration on past events or future concerns. Research on mindfulness-based interventions shows mixed effectiveness, with some studies demonstrating enhanced attentional control while others find limited transfer effects. The relationship between mindfulness practice and real-world social noticing behaviors remains inadequately examined. The psychological impact of being noticed involves multiple potential mechanisms. Feeling noticed may satisfy belonging needs, signal relationship priority, and enhance self-worth through perceived value to others. Alternatively, unwanted noticing may feel intrusive or create obligation. The valence of noticing effects likely depends on relationship context, noticing content, and individual preferences for attention versus privacy. Cultural variation in appropriate attention patterns affects both noticing behaviors and their interpretation. Some cultures value direct attention and explicit recognition of others' states, while others emphasize subtle awareness without explicit acknowledgement. High-context communication cultures may particularly value implicit noticing that demonstrates attentiveness without disrupting social harmony through overt attention calling. These cultural differences complicate universal prescriptions regarding noticing behaviors. The concept of mattering refers to the perception that one's existence makes a difference to others. Being noticed may contribute to mattering perceptions through evidence that one's presence and states are registered by others. Research suggests mattering relates to various well-being outcomes, including self-esteem and life satisfaction. However, the causal pathways between noticing behaviors, mattering perceptions, and psychological outcomes remain incompletely specified. Whether interventions increasing noticing behavior produce downstream well-being benefits represents an untested hypothesis. Rule 43. Confidence is comfort with imperfection. Self-efficacy refers to beliefs about personal capability to execute behaviors necessary to produce desired outcomes. High self-efficacy appears to enhance performance through multiple mechanisms, including increased effort, persistence, and effective strategy selection. However, the relationship between self-efficacy and actual competence is imperfect, with calibration mismatches producing either overconfidence or underconfidence. The optimal level of self-efficacy may involve slight overconfidence that enhances motivation without producing catastrophic errors from capability overestimation. Perfectionism involves setting unrealistically high standards and engaging in harsh self-criticism for perceived failures. Perfectionism appears multidimensional, with distinctions between self-oriented perfectionism involving personal standards, socially prescribed perfectionism involving perceived external expectations, and other-oriented perfectionism involving standards for others. Research suggests perfectionism correlates with various psychopathologies including anxiety, depression, and eating disorders. The mechanisms linking perfectionism to psychological distress remain debated, but may involve chronic self-evaluation threat and goal performance discrepancy distress. The concept of growth mindset proposes that beliefs about the malleability of abilities affect learning approaches and achievement patterns. Individuals with growth mindsets view abilities as developable through effort, while those with fixed mindsets view abilities as stable traits. This framework suggests that confidence might optimally involve belief in capability to develop competence rather than belief in current perfection. However, the empirical support for mindset interventions shows considerable heterogeneity, with some studies demonstrating substantial effects while others find minimal impact. Imposter phenomenon describes persistent feelings of fraudulence despite objective evidence of competence. Individuals experiencing imposter feelings attribute success to external factors like luck while internalizing failures. This pattern appears particularly common among high achievers and may be exacerbated by perfectionism. The relationship between imposter feelings and actual performance shows complex patterns, with moderate imposter feelings potentially motivating performance, while severe feelings impair functioning through anxiety. Self-compassion involves treating oneself with kindness during difficulty, recognizing shared human imperfection, and maintaining balanced awareness of negative emotions. Research suggests self-compassion correlates with various positive outcomes, including resilience, life satisfaction, and reduced anxiety. The relationship between self-compassion and confidence appears positive, potentially because self-compassion reduces defensiveness and enables more accurate self-assessment. Whether self-compassion training produces enhanced confidence represents an emerging research area with preliminary positive findings. The distinction between confidence and arrogance involves subjective judgments about whether self-assessment matches actual competence and whether self-presentation considers others' feelings. Confidence paired with accurate self-knowledge and appropriate humility may be viewed positively, while inflated self-assessment or dismissiveness toward others' capabilities may be labeled arrogance. These judgments likely vary with cultural norms, status relationships, and observer characteristics. The calibration between internal confidence and external presentation represents an ongoing social navigation challenge. Rule 44. Representation is invitation, widen the lens. Social identity theory proposes that individuals derive self-concept partly from group memberships. The visibility and valuation of one's groups in broader social contexts affects identity, security, and belonging sense. Representation of diverse identities in media, leadership, and social spaces may influence identity development through role modeling, norm establishment, and inclusion signaling. However, the specific mechanisms through which representation produces psychological effects and the boundary conditions limiting these effects remain inadequately specified. Stereotype threat describes performance impairment occurring when individuals fear confirming negative group stereotypes. The presence of individuals who counter stereotypes may reduce threat by providing existence proofs of group capability. However, token representation might alternatively increase pressure through solo status effects, where high visibility creates performance scrutiny. The conditions determining whether representation reduces versus exacerbates identity-related performance pressure require clarification. The concept of belonging uncertainty refers to doubt about whether one's social group is accepted in particular contexts. Cues suggesting group exclusion or devaluation may trigger belonging uncertainty that impairs performance and well-being through cognitive interference and stress. Representation may reduce belonging uncertainty by signaling inclusion, though the required representation levels and formats for producing meaningful effects remain empirically unestablished. Role modeling involves learning through observation of others' behaviors and outcomes. The effectiveness of role models appears to depend on multiple factors, including perceived similarity, model status, and outcome attributions. Diverse representation provides role models for underrepresented groups, potentially affecting career aspirations, self-efficacy, and behavior patterns. However, the identification of causal representation effects requires overcoming substantial methodological challenges, including self-selection and reverse causality concerns. Cultural variation in individualism collectivism affects the importance of group representation to individual well-being. Collectivist cultures showing stronger group identification may place higher value on group representation compared to individualist cultures, emphasizing personal uniqueness. These cultural differences moderate both representation impacts and optimal representation strategies. The generalizability of representation research, conducted primarily in Western individualist contexts, to global populations remains uncertain. The relationship between representation and tokenism presents practical dilemmas. Minimal representation may be perceived as symbolic gestures without substantive inclusion, potentially producing cynicism. However, concerns about tokenism may discourage representation efforts entirely. The threshold at which representation transitions from tokenism to meaningful inclusion likely varies across contexts and observer perspectives. The optimal approach is to increasing representation while avoiding tokenism dynamics represent ongoing organizational challenges. Rule 45. Don't meet someone's softness with structure. Emotional expression styles vary substantially across individuals, with some showing high emotional expressiveness while others maintain emotional restraint. When individuals who typically restrain emotions engage in vulnerability expression, this behavior may signal exceptional trust or distress. The appropriate response calibration to such rare vulnerability represents a form of emotional intelligence that appears highly variable across individuals. The concept of emotional labor refers to the regulation of emotional displays to meet occupational or social requirements. Continuous emotional labor appears psychologically costly, producing exhaustion and authenticity deficits. When individuals temporarily suspend emotional labor to express authentic vulnerability, responses that impose structure or redirect toward problem solving may be experienced as dismissive or as pressure to resume labor. The psychological costs of having vulnerability met with structure rather than matching vulnerability require empirical investigation. Attachment theory proposes that early caregiving experiences shape internal working models affecting adult relationship patterns. Secure attachment develops when caregivers provide consistent, responsive care, while insecure attachment emerges from inconsistent or rejecting care. The tendency to meet emotional expression with problem solving versus emotional reciprocation may relate to attachment history, with dismissive avoidant individuals showing greater discomfort with emotional expression. Whether deliberate response pattern modification can alter underlying attachment representations remains debated. The distinction between emotion-focused and problem-focused coping refers to different strategies for managing stress. Emotion-focused coping involves regulating emotional responses, while problem-focused coping involves changing the stressful situation. Different situations may call for different coping approaches, with uncontrollable stressors potentially requiring emotion-focused approaches, while controllable stressors benefit from problem-focused strategies. Matching support provision to coping needs represents a dimension of support effectiveness that depends on accurate situation assessment. Gender socialization appears to influence emotional expression and response patterns, with traditional masculine socialization discouraging emotional vulnerability while feminine socialization encourages emotional expression and responsiveness. These patterns may produce gender differences in both vulnerability, expression frequency, and support provision styles. However, substantial within-gender variation exists, and changing gender norms may be altering these traditional patterns. The extent to which observed gender differences reflect socialization versus other factors, including biological influences, remains contentious. The concept of emotional contagion describes the tendency for emotions to spread between individuals through automatic mimicry and physiological synchronization. Meeting vulnerability with matching emotional presence may facilitate contagion that produces shared emotional states and bonding. Alternatively, emotional structure provision might serve protective functions by preventing contagion of negative states. The optimal response likely depends on relationship type, context, and individual characteristics in ways that resist universal prescription. Rule 46. Model vulnerability so others can risk growth. Social learning theory proposes that behavior is acquired through observation of others' actions and consequences. Leaders or high-status individuals who model vulnerability may enable similar behavior in observers by demonstrating safety and normalcy. However, status asymmetries may produce differential consequences for vulnerability expression, with high-status vulnerability interpreted as confidence, while low-status vulnerability appears as weakness. The concept of psychological safety in groups refers to shared beliefs about interpersonal risk acceptance. Research suggests psychological safety predicts team learning, innovation, and performance through enabling information sharing, experimentation, and error acknowledgement. Leader vulnerability appears to contribute to psychological safety development, though the mechanisms and boundary conditions remain incompletely specified. Whether explicit vulnerability modeling produces measurable safety increases, or whether vulnerability must be organic, represents an unresolved question. Impression management theory examines strategic self-presentation to influence others' perceptions. Vulnerability expression involves deliberate image projection that signals authenticity, trustworthiness, or relatability. However, strategic vulnerability may be perceived as manipulative if observers detect instrumental motivation. The boundary between authentic and strategic vulnerability likely exists along a continuum rather than as discrete categories. The factors affecting authenticity, perception, and their consequences for modeling effectiveness require investigation. The relationship between leader vulnerability and follower trust shows complex patterns. Some research suggests vulnerability enhances trust through authenticity and relatability signals. However, excessive vulnerability might undermine confidence in leader competence or create anxiety about organizational stability. The optimal vulnerability level likely depends on organizational context, leader tenure, and crisis versus stability conditions. Cultural factors may also moderate optimal vulnerability levels, with some cultures valuing leader strength display while others appreciate humility and openness. Vicarious learning refers to learning through observation without direct experience. Witnessing others' vulnerability expressions and their consequences may inform observers' own vulnerability decisions. Positive consequences, including acceptance and support, may encourage observer vulnerability, while negative consequences, including rejection or exploitation, may discourage it. The extent to which vicarious learning from vulnerability observations produces durable behavioral changes versus situation-specific responses remains unclear. The concept of earned secure attachment proposes that individuals can develop attachment security despite insecure early experiences through corrective relationship experiences. Consistent responsive care, including appropriate vulnerability reciprocation, may enable attachment security development. Whether vulnerability modeling by attachment figures or peers contributes to this process, and the mechanisms through which such modeling might operate represent areas requiring theoretical development and empirical examination. Rule 47. Don't be the first one to laugh at your own joke. Humor appreciation involves cognitive processing of incongruity and affective response of mirth. The social dynamics of humor include performance by humor producers and reception by audiences. Laughter serves multiple functions, including genuine amusement expression, social bonding, and politeness. The sequencing of laughter following humor attempts carries social meaning that affects humor, evaluation, and relationship dynamics. The concept of humor confidence refers to beliefs about personal humor capability and comfort with humor performance. High humor confidence might predict earlier laughter at own jokes through reduced evaluation concern. Alternatively, humor expertise might involve greater awareness of audience response importance, producing delayed laughter. The relationship between humor, skill, and self-laughter timing has received minimal empirical attention. Social status and humor dynamics show complex relationships. High-status individuals may experience greater latitude in humor expression, including self-laughter without status threat. Low-status individuals might face greater pressure to demonstrate humor quality through audience response before expressing personal amusement. These status dynamics complicate attempts to provide universal humor performance guidance. The distinction between spontaneous and strategic laughter involves whether laughter represents genuine, uncontrolled mirth response or deliberate social behavior. Strategic self-laughter might serve functions including tension reduction, vulnerability display, or encouragement of audience laughter through modeling. However, strategic laughter perceived as such may backfire by appearing needy or manipulative. The factors affecting perceived spontaneity versus strategy remain inadequately examined. Cultural variation in appropriate laughter, timing, and intensity complicates universal prescription. Some cultures value restrained laughter, indicating sophistication, while others embrace enthusiastic laughter, suggesting joy and social comfort. These cultural differences affect both laughter behavior and its interpretation. The ability to recognize and adapt to varying cultural laughter norms represents a dimension of intercultural competence. The relationship between self-laughter timing and humor success likely shows curvilinear patterns. Very early self-laughter before punchline completion may impair humor delivery through timing disruption. Moderately delayed self-laughter following audience response might enhance social bonding through shared amusement. Absence of self-laughter might suggest either supreme confidence or humor producer discomfort with own material. The optimal timing likely varies with humor type, relationship context, and individual style preferences. Rule 48. Let others outgrow your memory of them. Person perception involves forming impressions of others' characteristics through observation and inference. These impressions become consolidated in memory as schemas that guide expectation formation and interaction patterns. Schema persistence occurs when initial impressions resist updating despite contradictory evidence, potentially due to confirmatory bias, attention selectivity, or memory reconstruction processes. The concept of identity foreclosure describes premature commitment to identity without adequate exploration. When others maintain outdated perceptions of one's identity, They may constrain identity development through social pressure toward consistency with established expectations. The psychological costs of identity constraint from others' rigid perceptions may include reduced self-exploration, authenticity deficits, and relationship dissatisfaction. Self-fulfilling prophecy describes the process through which expectations elicit behavior that confirms those expectations. If perceivers treat individuals according to outdated impressions, targets may respond consistently with those treatments, thereby confirming and perpetuating the outdated perceptions. The mechanisms underlying self-fulfilling prophecies include differential treatment, opportunity provision, and feedback patterns. The conditions enabling versus preventing self-fulfilling prophecies remain incompletely specified. The fundamental attribution error describes over-attribution of behavior to dispositions while underweighting situational factors. This bias may produce stable trait attributions from behaviors that actually reflect temporary states or specific situations. When combined with schema persistence, dispositional attributions may create rigid perceptions resistant to change evidence. Whether education about attribution biases reduces their occurrence or whether they reflect fundamental cognitive processes immune to modification remains debated. Developmental psychology emphasizes continuous change throughout lifespan. The failure to update perceptions of others' characteristics to reflect developmental changes may damage relationships through inaccuracy and constraint. The psychological processes enabling perception updating and factors that facilitate versus impede updating represent important but underexplored research areas. The concept of unconditional positive regard from humanistic psychology involves acceptance and support independent of specific behaviors or characteristics. This stance might facilitate identity exploration by reducing concern about disapproval for changes. However, the distinction between acceptance of identity change versus acceptance of problematic behavioral changes introduces complexity. The boundary between appropriate flexibility and enabling harmful patterns remains subjectively defined and contextually variable. Rule 49. Answer the call even if it's awkward. Communication channel selection research examines factors influencing choices between synchronous channels like voice calls versus asynchronous channels like text messaging. Preferences appear influenced by efficiency concerns, social anxiety, multitasking capability, and generational norms. The shift toward asynchronous text-based communication, particularly among younger demographics, reflects technological affordances and evolving social conventions. The concept of communication richness distinguishes channels by information carrying capacity. Voice communication preserves paralinguistic cues, including tone, pace, and emotional inflection, absent from text. This richness may be particularly valuable for emotionally complex or ambiguous situations. However, richness comes with costs including temporal demands, multitasking incompatibility, and increased social anxiety for some individuals. Social anxiety involves fear of negative evaluation in social situations. Synchronous voice communication may produce heightened anxiety through real-time performance demands, inability to revise statements, and attention to vocal characteristics. Text communication allows message composition time, revision opportunity, and paralinguistic feature elimination that may reduce anxiety. The relationship between communication channel preference and social anxiety appears robust, though its implications for relationship quality remain unclear. The psychological impact of call avoidance on relationship maintenance represents an underexplored area. Persistent preference for asynchronous communication may signal reduced relationship priority, create emotional distance through intimacy reduction, or produce misunderstandings through limited information transmission. However, these negative consequences may be mitigated if both parties share channel preferences or if relationship quality is maintained through alternative means. Generational differences in communication norms complicate universal guidance. Older generations socialized before ubiquitous text messaging may interpret call avoidance as rudeness or disengagement, while younger generations view calls as intrusive or inefficient. These generational differences in communication expectations may produce misunderstanding and relationship friction. The evolution of communication norms and their implications for intergenerational relationship quality deserve systematic attention. The concept of social presence refers to the degree to which communication channels enable feeling psychologically close to interaction partners. Research suggests voice communication produces higher social presence than text communication. Whether higher social presence consistently predicts better relationship outcomes, or whether optimal presence levels vary across relationship types and individual preferences remains an empirical question requiring investigation. Rule 50. Hold space instead of holding court. Conversational dominance involves disproportionate speaking time, interruption frequency, and topic control. Dominance patterns relate to status hierarchies, personality dimensions including extroversion and narcissism, and cultural communication norms. The psychological experience of being dominated in conversation appears aversive, producing feelings of dismissal, frustration, and reduced relationship satisfaction. The concept of active listening involves attending to speaker content, providing verbal and nonverbal feedback, and withholding judgment. Active listening appears to enhance speaker well-being through validation, clarification opportunity, and problem-solving facilitation. However, the specific mechanisms through which listening produces benefits and the boundary conditions limiting listening effectiveness remain inadequately specified in listening research literature. Turn-taking systems in conversation involve complex coordination between speakers through linguistic, paralinguistic, and non-verbal cues. These systems enable relatively smooth transitions between speakers with minimal overlap or gap. Individual differences in turn-taking behavior relate to cultural background, personality, and situation-specific goals. Violations of turn-taking norms through interruption or extended speaking turns may damage interaction quality and relationship perceptions. The relationship between extroversion and conversational behavior shows robust patterns, with extroverts displaying greater talkativeness, louder speech, and higher interruption rates. These behaviors may reflect extroversion's association with reward sensitivity and stimulation seeking. However, extroversion's relationship to listening quality appears more complex, with some evidence suggesting extroverts may be less attentive listeners, while other research finds no relationship. The mechanisms linking personality to conversation patterns require further specification. Narcissism involves grandiose self-views, entitlement, and empathy deficits. Narcissistic individuals show characteristic conversation patterns including self-focus, interruption, and topic redirection toward themselves. These patterns appear to serve self-enhancement and attention-seeking motivations. The interpersonal consequences of narcissistic conversation patterns include reduced likability, relationship conflict, and eventual social rejection. Whether narcissistic conversation patterns are modifiable through intervention or represent stable manifestations of personality pathology remains uncertain. The concept of holding space originates in therapeutic and spiritual contexts, referring to providing attentive presence without judgment, advice, or agenda. This practice involves suspending personal needs for expression or control to create psychological room for others' experiences. The application of holding space concepts to everyday conversation represents an extension beyond original contexts. Whether deliberate space-holding practices enhance relationship quality or feel artificial and forced likely varies with relationship type, individual authenticity, and implementation skill.